before concrete, before steel, before any machine we've ever invented. They built things we still cannot explain, structures so precisely engineered that modern architects study them in disbelief. Stones moved across hundreds of miles, without wheels, without cranes, aligned to stars with an accuracy that took us centuries to rediscover. Who were these people, and what did they know that we've forgotten? Over the next 3 hours, we're going to explore the most staggering prehistoric discoveries ever unearthed. Monuments to a human ingenuity that humbles everything we think we've achieved. So, sit back, relax, and let's go back to the beginning. Somewhere in the southern Ural steppes of Russia, where the wind moves through tall grass and the horizon stretches endlessly in every direction, there is a place that quietly rewritten everything we thought we knew about the ancient world. It has no grand tourist infrastructure, no iconic silhouette on a postcard, just a series of concentric earthen rings, barely visible at ground level, yet unmistakable from above. From the sky, Arkaim reveals itself like a fingerprint pressed into the earth thousands of years ago and never quite erased. It was discovered almost by accident. In 1987, Soviet archaeologists surveying a reservoir construction site stumbled upon something buried beneath the Russian steppe. What they found was so significant that the reservoir project was halted entirely, a rare decision in Soviet-era infrastructure politics. What they uncovered was a Bronze Age settlement, circular in design, dating back to roughly 2000 BC. A city, planned, engineered, and deliberately constructed by people we've largely forgotten. Arkaim belongs to what archaeologists now call the Sintashta culture, a civilization that emerged on the Eurasian steppe with little warning, and, in historical terms, disappeared just as quickly. They were Proto-Indo-European peoples, likely ancestors to cultures that would eventually spread across much of Europe and South Asia. They bred horses, they built chariots, among the earliest ever found, and they constructed Arkaim with a level of architectural precision that continues to puzzle researchers today. The settlement is roughly 170 meters in diameter. Its walls were built from adobe and timber, with 2 concentric rings of dwellings separated by a central street. Each home had its own hearth, its own well, and its own drainage system. A drainage system, in 2000 BC on the open steppe. But it's the geometry that gives pause. The layout of Arkaim appears to encode astronomical alignments with remarkable accuracy. Researchers have identified sightlines corresponding to solar and lunar events, solstices, equinoxes, lunar standstills, suggesting the entire city may have functioned, at least in part, as a sophisticated astronomical instrument. Some scholars compare it cautiously to Stonehenge, not in appearance but in ambition. Here the questions begin to multiply. Why would a nomadic or semi-nomadic people invest this level of effort in a permanent, geometrically complex urban structure? Why does the city appear fully formed, without the archaeological evidence of earlier, simpler settlements leading up to it? And perhaps most strangely, why did they abandon it? When Arkaim was left, it appears to have been deliberately burned, not destroyed by enemies. Burned from within, systematically, as if the inhabitants chose to erase what they had built before walking away. What were they leaving? What were they afraid of leaving behind? Some researchers have proposed more unconventional readings. Russian nationalists, in the decades following its discovery, embraced Arkaim as a sacred cradle of Slavic civilization, a claim most archaeologists firmly reject, though it speaks to the site's powerful grip on the imagination. Others have noted that its astronomical precision implies a priestly or scholarly class with accumulated generational knowledge, raising questions about what written or oral records may have existed and have since vanished entirely. there are those who go further still, who see in Arkaim's geometry something that transcends Bronze Age capability, who ask whether the Sintashta people were preserving knowledge inherited from an even earlier, unidentified source. Most archaeologists would dispute that. The evidence, they say, reflects a sophisticated but explicable human achievement. And yet, the drainage systems, the astronomical alignments, the deliberate burning, the silence afterward. Arkaim was not a simple settlement. Of that, almost everyone agrees. What it truly was remains an open question pressed into the Russian earth. Waiting. We leave the Russian steppe behind. We leave its wind, its silence, its burned and buried circles. But the questions we carry with us don't change. If anything, they deepen. Because Arkaim is not alone in its strangeness. Across the ancient world, in places separated by thousands of miles and centuries of time, people were building structures that don't fit neatly into the story we tell ourselves about early civilization. Structures that suggest knowledge, purpose, and ambition far beyond what we typically assign to prehistoric peoples. Our next stop is an island, sun-bleached and ancient, sitting in the middle of the Mediterranean like a stone dropped into still water. Sardinia. Most people who visit Sardinia come for the coastline, turquoise water, white sand, the particular quality of light that makes the Mediterranean feel timeless. Few venture inland to a quiet stretch of agricultural land in the northwest of the island, near the city of Sassari, and fewer still know what waits there, half hidden among the fields. Monte d'Acodi. From a distance, it looks almost like a natural hill, a broad, flat-topped mound rising from the surrounding plain, connected to the earth by a long, sloping ramp. But as you approach, the geometry becomes impossible to ignore. The edges are too straight, the angles too deliberate, the ramp too precisely inclined. This is not a hill. It is a structure, a stepped platform built by human hands, somewhere between 4000 and 2700 BC, making it one of the oldest monuments in the Western Mediterranean, and perhaps one of the strangest. What archaeologists have uncovered at Monte d'Acodi is, in many ways, a story of layers. The site began as a rectangular mud brick platform, modest by later standards, but already unusual for Neolithic Sardinia. Then, around 3000 BC, something changed. A second larger structure was built directly over the first, encasing it entirely. The original monument wasn't demolished. It wasn't abandoned. It was preserved, deliberately sealed inside its successor, like a secret held inside a secret. The final structure measured roughly 36 by 29 meters at its base, rising in steps toward a flat summit. That ramp, nearly 42 meters long, leads directly to the top, wide enough to walk up slowly, ceremonially. Archaeologists believe the summit once supported a small building or shrine, though little of it remains. Around the base of the structure, excavations have revealed a carefully arranged landscape. Stone-lined altars, ritual deposits, animal bones, fragments of pottery. There is a large spherical stone and a smooth, elongated boulder nearby, their purpose debated, their placement clearly intentional. This was not a defensive structure, not a storage facility, not a home. It was built for something else entirely. The mainstream interpretation is that Monte d'Acodi served as a ceremonial or religious platform, a kind of altar raised above the surrounding land, where rituals were performed, offerings made, perhaps where the boundary between the human world and whatever lay beyond it felt thinner than usual. That explanation is reasonable. It is supported by the archaeological evidence, and it still leaves an enormous amount unexplained. Consider the ramp. In Neolithic Europe, raised ceremonial platforms are not unheard of, but the specific combination of a stepped base, a summit shrine, and a monumental access ramp is extraordinarily rare. So rare, in fact, that when researchers first fully documented Monte Ducati in the 20th century, some were struck by an almost uncomfortable resemblance to something built thousands of miles away and thousands of years later. A Mesopotamian ziggurat. The similarity is not exact, scholars are careful to note that. But the structural logic, a raised sacred platform, accessed by a ramp, crowned with a ritual space, echoes across cultures with an insistence that is difficult to simply dismiss as coincidence. Did the Neolithic peoples of Sardinia independently arrive at the same architectural solution as the civilizations of ancient Mesopotamia? Or were there, even then, threads of contact, exchange, or shared inheritance moving across the ancient world in ways we haven't fully traced? No one has answered that question. Not conclusively. What we know about the people who built Monte Ducati is fragmentary. They belonged to the Ozieri culture, a Neolithic society that flourished in Sardinia roughly between 3500 and 2700 BC. They were farmers and herders, makers of remarkably sophisticated pottery, builders of collective tombs carved directly into rock. They were, by any reasonable measure, a capable and culturally complex people. But Monte Ducati stands apart even within their own remarkable legacy. The scale of the project, the labor, the planning, the decision to encase one monument inside another rather than simply rebuild, implies a degree of institutional organization, of coordinated intention, that raises questions we struggle to fully answer. Who directed this construction? What authority, spiritual or political, could mobilize that kind of collective effort in a pre-literate society? And what happened inside that summit shrine? What rituals, what beliefs, what understanding of the cosmos were being enacted on that elevated platform above the Sardinian plain? The site was eventually abandoned, somewhere around 2000 BC, following what appears to have been a period of disruption or cultural transition across the island. Whatever knowledge was held there, whatever tradition animated the ceremonies performed on that ramp, on that summit, it did not survive in any written form. There are those who look at Monte Ducati and see something even more provocative. They point to the astronomical orientation of the structure, to the placement of the surrounding stones, and suggest that the platform may have served as an observatory or calendrical instrument, a way of marking time, tracking celestial cycles, connecting the rhythms of the earth to whatever powers the builders believed governed them. These theories remain on the outer edges of academic consensus, but they are asked seriously by serious people. And, in the absence of written records, in the silence that surrounds this sun-bleached mound rising from the Sardinian fields, they are not easily dismissed. Monte Ducati is older than the pyramids, older than Stonehenge in its final form, and yet most people have never heard its name. Whatever was celebrated here, whatever was believed, whatever was known, it was considered important enough to bury one monument inside another, to build a ramp to the sky, to align stone with a precision that still holds after 5,000 years. The ramp is still there. It still leads upward. We just no longer know what we were meant to find at the top. We have moved from a burned city on the Russian steppe to a ziggurat-like altar rising from a Mediterranean island. Each step in this journey has taken us further from the comfortable boundaries of what we think we know about prehistoric humanity. Now we cross to the far edge of the ancient world, to the green, rain-soaked heart of Ireland, to a place where the land itself seems to remember something the rest of us have forgotten. Ireland holds its mysteries quietly. It doesn't announce them. They sit beneath the surface, beneath the fields, beneath the pastures, beneath centuries of Christian tradition layered carefully over something far older. And in County Tipperary, on a low, broad hilltop surrounded by some of the most fertile land in Europe, one of those mysteries has been slowly emerging from the earth. It is called the Nemed of Anu. The word Nemed is ancient Irish. It means sacred enclosure, a place set apart, consecrated, held apart from ordinary life by boundary and intention. It is a word that appears throughout early Irish mythology, always carrying the same weight. This ground is different. This ground belongs to something else. And Anu, in the oldest layers of Irish mythology, is the mother goddess, the earth herself, made divine, the source of fertility, of abundance, of life continuing from one generation to the next. 2 hills in Kerry still bear her name, the Paps of Anu, shaped so precisely like a woman's body that it seems impossible to believe it is entirely natural. The ancient Irish did not think it was. They believed the land was her, literally, physically. That to farm it was to participate in something sacred. So when archaeologists began uncovering a massive ceremonial enclosure associated with her name, a Nemed, a sacred space, the significance was immediately apparent. What they found was not a small ritual site. It was enormous. The enclosure consists of a massive circular earthwork, a bank and ditch system defining a space that archaeologists have dated to the late Neolithic or early Bronze Age, roughly 2500 to 2000 BC. The scale of the earthwork suggests a construction effort that would have required sustained, organized labor across an extended period. This was not a spontaneous gathering place. It was planned. It was built with intention, and it was built to last. Within and around the enclosure, excavations have revealed evidence of repeated, prolonged ritual activity. Deposits of animal bone, cattle predominantly, suggest large-scale feasting or sacrificial practice. Fragments of deliberately broken pottery, traces of fire, the quiet, accumulated residue of ceremony repeated across generations. The mainstream interpretation places the Nemed of Anu firmly within a broader tradition of Neolithic and Bronze Age ceremonial landscapes that we see across the British Isles and Ireland. The same impulse that raised Stonehenge, that shaped the Great Passage tombs of the Boyne Valley, that carved the landscape of Orkney into something resembling a cathedral without walls. These were societies that organized enormous collective effort around ritual and cosmology. That much is well established, but the specific character of this site, its association with Anu, its placement within a landscape already dense with mythological resonance, raises questions that archaeology alone cannot fully answer. Because the Irish mythological tradition is unusually old, unusually persistent, and unusually specific, the texts that preserve it, written down by Christian monks in the medieval period, are copies of traditions far older than the manuscripts themselves. Scholars debate how far back those oral traditions reach. Some suggest the mythology preserves genuine cultural memory, stretching back to the Bronze Age or beyond. Memory of real places, real practices, real beliefs encoded in story, because there was no other way to transmit them across the centuries. If that is true, then the Nemed of Anu is not merely an archaeological site. It is a place where myth and earth converge, where the stories the Irish told about themselves for thousands of years may have their roots in something physically, measurably real. And that convergence raises uncomfortable questions. The mythology surrounding Anu speaks of a time before history, before the present order of things. The Tuatha De Danann, the divine race associated with her, are described in medieval texts as beings of extraordinary power and knowledge who inhabited Ireland before the arrival of mortal humans. They were not gods in the Greek sense, remote and untouchable. They were present. They were in the land. And when they were finally displaced, they did not leave. They went beneath the surface, into the hollow hills, into the Side, the fairy mounds, and continued to exist just out of reach of ordinary perception. what do we do with that? Most scholars treat it as rich mythology, as symbolic narrative encoding ideas about nature, ancestry, and the sacred landscape, and that interpretation is entirely defensible. But there are researchers who ask a different question. What if the memory of a sacred enclosure, a real physical place used for real ceremonies across real generations, became, over the centuries, transformed into myth? What if the Nemed of Anu is the origin point of something the Irish mythological tradition preserved without fully understanding what it was preserving? The enclosure sits on its hilltop still. The earthworks remain, softened by millennia of rain and grass, but still legible to the trained eye. The land around it is quiet, productive, unremarkable to those who don't know what they're standing near, but stand at the edge of that ancient ditch and look out across the Tipperary plain, and something settles in the air around you that is difficult to name. This ground was chosen for a reason. People gathered here, generation after generation, for a reason. They shaped the earth, burned fires, broke pottery, feasted, and perhaps mourned, for a reason. Whatever that reason was, whatever Anu meant to the people who built this enclosure and returned to it across centuries, it did not survive the transition to the written word intact. It became myth, it became landscape, it became silence, and the silence, here, is very old. We have been moving, quietly, across the ancient world, from the burned circles of the Russian steppe, from a ziggurat-like altar rising from Sardinian soil, from a sacred enclosure in the green heart of Ireland, where myth and earth press against each other like two hands clasped in prayer. Each of these places was built by people we know very little about. Each carries the same quiet insistence that something was understood, something was practiced, something was organized and sustained across generations that we have not yet fully grasped. Now we travel east, far east, to a range of hills in what is today China's Liaoning province, where the land folds into dry ridges and river valleys, and where the wind, in certain seasons, carries a particular quality of stillness. Here, buried beneath centuries of soil and silence, archaeologists found something that rewrote the early history of Chinese civilization. They called it Niuheliang. The site sits in a remote stretch of the Hongshan cultural region, a landscape that doesn't immediately announce its significance. Low hills, pale grasses, the kind of terrain that holds its secrets patiently, for as long as it needs to. Excavations beginning in the 1980s began to reveal the scale of what lay beneath. Niuheliang is not a single structure. It is a complex, a ritual landscape stretching across multiple hilltops, connected by intention, if not always by visible pathways. Burial mounds, stone altars, ceremonial platforms, and at its center something that no one had expected to find in Neolithic northeastern China. A temple, not a modest ceremonial space. A constructed building, partially underground, its walls built from fired clay, containing something that stopped the archaeologists in their tracks. Fragments, human-sized, female, sculpted from clay with a degree of naturalism that felt, to those who first uncovered them, genuinely startling. Inlaid eyes of jade, carefully modeled features. The remains, it became clear, of multiple goddess figures, some human-sized, some considerably larger, arranged within a structure that had clearly served as a place of worship. This was the goddess temple of Niuheliang, and it was built approximately 5,500 years ago. The Hongshan culture, to which Niuheliang belongs, flourished in northeastern China roughly between 4700 and 2900 BC. They were not a civilization in the way we typically use that word. No cities, no writing system, no bronze metallurgy. And yet, what they built at Niuheliang challenges the assumption that complexity requires those things. The ritual complex covers an area of approximately 50 square kilometers. The burial mounds, called stone mound tombs, are carefully constructed, their occupants interred with jade objects of remarkable craftsmanship. The jade itself tells a story, sourced from distant regions, worked with tools that should not, by conventional understanding, have been capable of such precision. The C-shaped jade dragons found at Hongshan sites are among the earliest dragon figures in Chinese art, a form that would persist for 5,000 years without interruption. And presiding over all of it, the goddess, or goddesses. The temple at Niuheliang contained figures of varying scales, suggesting perhaps a hierarchy, a greater and lesser divine order, or perhaps different aspects of a single concept too large to be captured in one form. Who was she? What did she represent to the people who shaped her face from clay and placed jade in her eyes? The mainstream interpretation links the goddess figures to fertility and ancestor veneration, practices common across Neolithic cultures worldwide. The Hongshan people, this reading suggests, built a sophisticated ceremonial center to honor divine female power, to ensure agricultural abundance, to connect the living with the dead through ritual and offering. That interpretation is well supported. It is probably, in its broad outlines, correct, but it does not explain everything. Consider the scale of organization required to construct and maintain Niuheliang across what appears to have been centuries of continuous use. The transport of jade from distant sources, the skilled labor required to build fired clay walls in a region with no later tradition of that specific technique. The astronomical alignments that some researchers have identified in the placement of the burial mounds, orientations toward solar and lunar events that mirror, in their logic if not their form, alignments found at prehistoric sites thousands of miles away. Who coordinated this? What social structure sustained it? There is no evidence at Niuheliang of the hierarchical markers we typically associate with complex societies. No palaces, no warrior burials laden with weapons, no evidence of coercive political power. And yet the site demanded and received a level of collective investment that implies something we don't have a comfortable name for. A form of authority rooted not in force but in something else. Belief, perhaps, or knowledge. Some researchers have pointed to the goddess cult as itself the organizing principle, that the religious tradition centered at Niuheliang was the institution, that the temple was the palace, that the priests or priestesses who tended the goddess figures held a form of power we rarely assign to Neolithic societies. Others have gone further, noting that the jade dragon forms found at Hongshan sites bear a symbolic continuity with later Chinese civilization that is difficult to explain as coincidence, suggesting that what began at Niuheliang did not end there, that something passed forward through the millennia, transformed but not extinguished, into the civilizations we know by name. What was transmitted, and how? Through bloodlines, through trade, through the simple persistent human instinct to repeat what feels sacred until it becomes tradition, and tradition becomes culture, and culture becomes history. The goddess temple no longer stands. What remains are fragments, the clay walls, the broken figures, the jade-eyed faces looking up at archaeologists from 5,500 years of darkness. But she was there, she was built and tended and returned to, across generations of people whose names we will never know. And somewhere in those inlaid jade eyes, in that careful, deliberate gaze shaped by hands that turned to dust millennia ago, there is a question still looking for an answer. What did they see when they looked at her face? What did they believe she saw when she looked back? We have looked into the jade eyes of a goddess half a world away. We have stood at the edge of Irish earthworks where myth pressed up through the soil like something alive. We have traced the outline of a Bronze Age city on the Russian steppe and climbed, in our imagination, the ancient ramp of a Sardinian altar that should not exist. Each time, the same pattern emerges. People we underestimate, structures we cannot fully explain, organization and intention on a scale that sits uncomfortably with the story we tell about early humanity, that we began simple and slowly, painfully, became complex. Now we cross an ocean. We move to the western edge of South America, to a narrow coastal desert wedged between the Pacific and the Andes, where almost nothing grows and almost nothing rains, and where the dry air has preserved, for thousands of years, secrets that the rest of the world has only recently begun to hear. We are in Peru, and we are going back further than most people realize is possible. The Chasma Sechin Valley cuts through the coastal desert of the Ancash region like a wound in pale earth. The Andes rise to the east, snow-capped and indifferent. The Pacific lies somewhere to the west, hidden behind a haze of coastal fog. Between them, in this narrow corridor of irrigated green surrounded by dust and stone, human beings were building something extraordinary. They were building Sechin Bajo. From the surface, the site does not immediately reveal its age. There are mounds. There are outlines of structures visible to the trained eye. There is the particular stillness of a place that has absorbed a great deal of human activity and is no longer required to perform it. Archaeologists have worked here for decades, carefully removing layers of earth that turned out to be, in some cases, layers of centuries. What they found beneath those layers stopped the academic world in its tracks. A circular plaza, stone-built, carefully constructed, oriented with deliberate precision, dated through radiocarbon analysis to approximately 3,500 BC. That date requires a moment of stillness to absorb, 3,500 BC. That is roughly contemporaneous with the earliest phases of ancient Egyptian civilization. It predates the pyramids of Giza by nearly 1,000 years, and it sits in the Americas, a continent which, according to conventional historical timelines, was not supposed to produce monumental architecture anywhere near that early. Sechin Bajo rewrote that timeline. Quietly, without fanfare, in a valley most people couldn't find on a map. The circular plaza is the oldest structure identified so far, but it is not the only one. The site contains multiple phases of construction, layered across nearly 2,000 years of continuous occupation and building. Later phases added rectangular platforms, ceremonial courts, and architectural elements that grew progressively more elaborate over time. The site as a whole belongs to what archaeologists call the Norte Chico civilization, also known as Caral Supe, a culture that flourished along the Peruvian coast between roughly 3000 and 1800 BC, and which now holds the distinction of being the oldest known civilization in the Americas. But Sechin Bajo pushes even that boundary further back. The people who built here left no writing, no pottery in the earliest phases, an absence so unusual that it challenges the standard markers archaeologists use to define civilization. They did leave something else. Quipus, knotted string devices that some researchers believe functioned as a recording system, encoding information in the pattern and arrangement of knots. The quipu would persist in Andean cultures for thousands of years, eventually becoming the administrative tool of the Inca Empire. Whether the earliest versions found in Norte Chico contexts represent a true proto-writing system remains one of the more quietly explosive debates in South American archaeology. What sustained Sechin Bajo? What fed the labor force that quarried stone and shaped plazas in a coastal desert? The answer, researchers believe, is the sea. The Peruvian coast sits above one of the most productive marine ecosystems on Earth. Anchovies, in particular, in quantities almost impossible to imagine. The Norte Chico people appear to have organized their economy around fishing on a massive, coordinated scale, using cotton nets woven inland to harvest protein from the ocean, freeing a significant portion of the population from food production and redirecting that labor toward construction and ceremony. It is an elegant solution, a sophisticated one, a solution that implies planning, surplus management, and economic coordination of a kind we don't typically associate with a society that left no written records and made no pottery. And here, the questions begin to accumulate. The circular plaza at Sechin Bajo is not unique in the Norte Chico world. Similar circular forecourts appear at other sites across the region, at Carao, at Huaricanga, at Vichama, with a consistency that implies not just cultural connection, but a shared cosmological framework, a shared understanding of what sacred space should look like and how it should be oriented. Why circular? What did the circle mean to these people in this desert, at this moment in human history? The same question echoes across our entire journey, from the circular rings of Arkaim to the ceremonial enclosure of the Nemed of Anu. Something about the circle, in culture after culture, separated by oceans and millennia, carried a weight of meaning that rectangular space did not. Was that convergence independent? Or does it point toward something deeper in human cognition, a universal grammar of the sacred that emerges wherever people begin to think seriously about their place in the cosmos? There are researchers who go further still, who look at the organizational complexity of Norte Chico, the coordinated fishing, the monumental construction, the apparent absence of warfare in the archaeological record, the strange democracy of a civilization that built no palaces and left no evidence of a warrior class, and see something that doesn't fit any of our existing models. Not a primitive precursor to later civilizations. Something else. Something that developed along its own logic, answered its own questions, and then, around 1800 BC, quietly faded, leaving behind circular plazas and knotted strings and a silence the desert has kept faithfully ever since. The mounds of Sechin Bajo are still there. The circular plaza still holds its shape beneath the Peruvian sky, and somewhere in that geometry, in the decision made 5,500 years ago to build a circle in the desert and fill it with ceremony, there is an intention we have not yet fully read. We have the shape. We are still searching for the meaning. We leave Peru behind. We leave its coastal desert and its circular plazas and its knotted strings encoding messages we cannot yet read. We carry with us the same question that has followed us across every continent on this journey. Not just how these things were built, but why. What compelled ordinary human beings in every corner of the ancient world to organize collective effort on a scale that still humbles us today. The answer, each time, seems to involve the same convergence, belief, knowledge, and a relationship with stone that we have largely lost. We return now to the Mediterranean, to that sun-warmed island we visited earlier in our journey, where we stood before a ziggurat-like altar and wondered about the people who built it. We return to Sardinia, but this time we are looking at something different. Something that, even by Sardinia's extraordinary standards of prehistoric architecture, stands apart. It rises from the flat plain of the Melogu region in northern Sardinia, like something that was not built so much as grown from the earth itself. A tower of dark basalt, massive and brooding, its silhouette against the Sardinian sky carrying a weight that is difficult to account for in purely architectural terms. This is Nuraghe Santu Antine, and it is one of the most sophisticated prehistoric structures ever built in Europe. The Nuraghe as a form is unique to Sardinia. Across the island, more than 7,000 of them survive in various states of preservation, truncated cones of dry stone masonry, built without mortar, without written plans, without any of the tools we associate with complex construction. They range from simple single towers to elaborate complexes with multiple towers, connected by curtain walls and internal courtyards. They were built by the Nuraghe civilization, a culture that emerged on Sardinia around 1800 BC and persisted, in various forms, for over 1,000 years. Santu Antine is among the largest and most complex of them all. The central tower, the keep, in the language of later medieval architecture, though that comparison barely does it justice, rises to a surviving height of roughly 17 meters. It once stood taller. Its walls, in places over 4 meters thick, are built from massive basalt blocks fitted together with a precision that requires no mortar to hold them. They hold each other. They have held each other for 3,000 years. Inside, a spiral staircase cut into the thickness of the wall winds upward through 3 chambers stacked vertically, each roofed with a corbelled vault, a technique in which successive rings of stone are laid in gradually narrowing circles until they meet at the apex, creating a domed ceiling of extraordinary strength and elegance. No keystone, no arch, just stone laid against stone, each layer trusting the one below it, the geometry of the structure itself providing the stability. The central tower is surrounded by a triangular outer wall connecting 3 additional towers, enclosing a courtyard with a well. Beyond that, a village of circular stone huts spreads outward, a community that lived in the shadow and perhaps under the protection of the great tower at its center. The mainstream interpretation of the Nuraghe, including Santu Antine, centers on defense. These were fortified towers, this reading suggests, built by a warrior society to control territory, project power, and provide refuge in times of conflict. The thick walls, the elevated position, the narrow entrances, all support this reading, and it is probably partially correct. But partial explanations, by this point in our journey, have begun to feel insufficient. Because the Nuraghe of Sardinia were not built quickly or carelessly, the corbelled chambers of Santu Antine were constructed with a sophistication that goes well beyond military necessity. The acoustic properties of those domed interiors, the way sound moves within them, have attracted the attention of researchers studying prehistoric soundscapes and their possible ritual function. Some have noted that the chambers produce resonance effects at specific frequencies, and have asked whether that was accidental or intentional, whether the builders of Santu Antine understood something about sound, space, and the human body that we are only beginning to rediscover. The astronomical dimensions of the Nuraghe have also drawn increasing attention. Researchers have identified alignments in Santu Antine and other major Nuraghe that correspond to solar and lunar events, orientations that place them again in that long, strange tradition of prehistoric structures organized around the movements of the sky, a tradition we have encountered at Arkaim, at Monte at Niuheliang, at Sechin Bajo. The same question, asked in every language, on every continent. Where are we in relation to the cosmos? And how do we build that question into stone so it outlasts us? What we know of the Nuraghic people themselves remains frustratingly incomplete. They left no writing. The artifacts recovered from Nuraghic sites, bronze figurines of extraordinary delicacy, pottery, weapons, votive objects, suggest a sophisticated and artistically accomplished culture. Their bronze figurines in particular have attracted scholarly attention for the complexity and expressiveness of their modeling. These were not a people operating at the edge of capability. They were operating well within it, and yet they vanished. Or rather, they were absorbed, by Phoenician traders, by Carthaginian settlers, eventually by Rome. Their language disappeared. Their traditions were overwritten. What they knew about the towers they built, the full purpose, the complete cosmology, the ceremonies that once filled those resonant corbelled chambers, went with them into silence. 7,000 Nuraghe remain on the island. 7,000 stone towers, standing in fields and on hillsides, visible from roads and beaches, so numerous that Sardinians have lived alongside them for centuries without always stopping to ask what they truly mean. Santu Antine is the greatest of them, and standing at its base, looking up at those dark basalt courses rising toward the sky, the question is not whether it could have been built. It was built. The evidence is right there, 3,000 years old and still standing. The question is what it meant to the people who built it, what they felt, climbing that spiral stair in the darkness, emerging into a corbelled chamber where sound moved in ways that didn't behave like ordinary rooms, what they were reaching for when they built this high and this carefully. That answer is still somewhere inside the stone, waiting for a question precise enough to draw it out. We leave Sardinia's dark basalt towers behind. We leave their corbelled chambers and their unanswered acoustics, and their 7,000 silent sentinels standing in fields across an island that has forgotten what they were truly for. We travel north now, far north, away from the Mediterranean warmth, away from the sun-bleached stone and the olive-scented air. We move toward cold, toward gray, toward a coastline so exposed to the raw force of the Atlantic that it feels less like land and more like an argument between the earth and the ocean that hasn't been settled yet. We are going to Orkney, a scattered archipelago off the northern tip of Scotland, where the wind is not weather so much as a permanent condition, and where the light in summer never quite disappears, and where the ground, it turns out, has been keeping a secret for 5,000 years. The secret has a name, Skara Brae. It was the storm that revealed it. In the winter of 1850, a violent tempest stripped the grass and soil from a coastal dune on the bay of Skyle, exposing beneath it the outlines of stone structures that no one living had ever seen. What the storm uncovered, and what archaeologists have spent the better part of 2 centuries carefully excavating, is a Neolithic village so remarkably preserved that it has been called, with only slight exaggeration, the Scottish Pompeii. It was inhabited between approximately 3,100 and 2,500 BC. That places it firmly in the same broad era as Stonehenge, as the Great Passage Tomb of Newgrange in Ireland, as the earliest phases of Egyptian civilization. And yet, what makes Skara Brae extraordinary is not its age alone. It is the intimacy of what survives. Most prehistoric sites give us outlines, foundations, post holes, the ghost of a structure, readable only to trained eyes. Skara Brae gives us rooms, 8 stone houses, connected by covered passageways, sunk partially into the earth, or more precisely, into a midden. A vast accumulation of organic waste that acted as insulation against the Orcadian wind. The walls still stand. The doorways with their stone slab closures are still intact, and inside each house the furniture remains. Stone furniture, because on Orkney there is almost no timber. The people of Skara Brae built everything from the one material the island provided in abundance. Stone beds, still lined with the outlines of where heather or bracken would have been laid for softness. Stone shelving units against the walls. Dresser-like structures facing the entrance of each home, the first thing a visitor would see upon entering. Stone hearths at the center of each room, their position so consistent across all 8 houses that they speak of a shared and deeply ingrained sense of how domestic space should be organized. This was not improvised living. This was culture. This was a community with strong shared ideas about the proper order of things, about where you slept, where you cooked, where you stored your belongings, and what you wanted people to see when they stepped through your door. The mainstream interpretation presents Skara Brae as a settled farming and fishing community, people who kept cattle and sheep, who grew crops in the fertile Orcadian soil, who fished the surrounding waters, and who built their village with the particular ingenuity of people who had learned to work within the constraints of their environment. It is a reading that is warm, human, and almost certainly correct in its broad outlines. And yet the details resist full domestication. Those stone dressers, for instance. In every house, the dresser faces the entrance, a position of prominence, of visibility. Archaeologists have noted that this is not the most practical location for storage. It is, however, the most ceremonial. Some have suggested the dressers held objects of ritual significance, that what was displayed on them was not food or tools, but something meant to be seen, acknowledged, perhaps venerated. If so, then each house at Skara Brae was not merely a home, but a domestic shrine. The boundary between the everyday and the sacred dissolved into a single shared space. The passageways that connect the houses add another layer of strangeness. They are low, narrow, and deliberately designed. Not accidental connections, but intentional architecture that linked the community into something more unified than a collection of separate dwellings. Moving through Skara Brae required moving through other people's space. Privacy, as we understand it, may not have been the organizing principle here. Togetherness may have been. There are objects that deepen the mystery further. Carved stone balls, found across Orkney and northeastern Scotland, appear at Skara Brae and at other Neolithic sites in the region. They are precisely spherical, intricately decorated with geometric patterns, and their purpose remains entirely unknown. They are too carefully made to be casual objects, too numerous to be unique treasures. They have been proposed as weights, as calendar devices, as ceremonial objects, as tokens of social exchange. None of these explanations has fully satisfied the people who study them. Some researchers have looked at the overall Orcadian landscape, at Skara Brae, at the Ring of Brodgar, at the stones of Stennis, at Maeshowe, and see not a collection of separate sites, but a single integrated ceremonial complex, a landscape deliberately shaped over centuries by a community with a coherent and sophisticated cosmological vision, a vision we have only fragmentary access to. Who were these people truly? They left no writing. The organic materials that might have told us more, clothing, food, wooden objects, are almost entirely gone. What remains is stone, walls and beds and shelves and hearths, arranged with a consistency that implies deep cultural conviction. And then, around 2500 BC, they left. Whether gradually or suddenly, the archaeological record does not clearly say. The houses were abandoned, the passageways emptied. The stone dressers were left facing doorways that no one would walk through again. The storm that revealed Skara Brae in 1850 gave us something extraordinary. A window into a life lived 5,000 years ago with a fullness and a specificity that almost no other prehistoric site can match. But windows only show us so much. What was displayed on those stone shelves, in those quiet rooms facing the door? And what did it mean to the people who arranged it there every morning before they stepped out into the Orcadian wind? We step back from those empty stone doorways in Orkney. We leave behind the quiet rooms and the stone shelves facing doors that no one has walked through for 4,500 years. We carry with us that same feeling of having been close to something, of having almost understood it, and then having it slip just beyond reach. We move south now, down through the British Isles, across the English Channel, into the northwest of France, into Brittany, that rugged, sea-battered peninsula that juts into the Atlantic like a fist, where the Celtic language survived long after it disappeared from most of Europe, and where the land is so dense with prehistoric monuments that you can barely drive a kilometer without passing something ancient. The sea here is tidal and restless. The light is the particular silver gray of the Atlantic coast, and at the tip of a small peninsula in the Gulf of Morbihan, where the water is almost calm and the land curves gently around it like cupped hands, there is a collection of stones that deserves to stop us completely. This is Locmariaquer. It is not one monument, but several, clustered within a small area, and connected by an age and an ambition that speaks of a single, sustained moment in human history when something remarkable was being attempted on this stretch of Breton coastline. The most immediately staggering of them is what remains of the Grand Menhir Brise, the Great Broken Menhir. It lies on the ground in 4 pieces, its fall ancient, the cause still debated. But even horizontal, even fractured, it communicates something that takes a moment to fully absorb. When it stood, and it did stand, the evidence is clear, it rose to a height of approximately 20 meters. It weighed, by careful modern estimate, around 280 tons. It was quarried from granite found approximately 4 kilometers away, and transported to this coastal site by people who had no metal tools, no wheeled vehicles, and no beasts of burden capable of moving anything close to that weight. And they raised it, upright. A single stone, 20 meters tall, standing alone on the Breton coast like a declaration. The Grand Menhir Brise dates to approximately 4,700 BC. That is not a misprint. Nearly 7,000 years ago, in what is now northwestern France, human beings decided to move a 280-ton block of granite 4 kilometers across uneven terrain and erect it vertically. We do not know, with any certainty, how. The Ergra tumulus lies nearby, a long burial mound, one of the largest in Brittany, stretching over 100 meters in length, and containing a complex of internal chambers built from massive stone slabs. It belongs to the same broad period and the same cultural tradition, and nearby still, the Table des Marchands, a passage tomb whose capstone, weighing around 40 tons, was decorated on its underside with carved images before being placed in position. Carvings that would be invisible once the stone was laid, made for no living eye to see. That detail is worth pausing on. Whoever carved the underside of that capstone knew it would never be seen again once the tomb was sealed. They carved it anyway. The act of carving, the inscription itself, mattered more than the audience. What does that tell us about how these people understood the relationship between the visible world and whatever they believed lay beyond it? The mainstream interpretation of the Locmariaquer complex places it within the broader tradition of Atlantic megalithic culture, a phenomenon that stretched from Portugal to Scandinavia between roughly 4,500 and 2,500 BC, during which coastal and inland communities across Western Europe were constructing monuments from massive stones with a consistency that implies cultural connection, shared belief, or both. The monuments served, this reading suggests, as territorial markers, as ancestral tombs, as gathering places for communities spread across a landscape without permanent urban centers. All of that is probably true. None of it fully explains the Grand Menhir Brise. Because a 280-ton standing stone is not a territorial marker in any practical sense. It is not a tomb, it is not a gathering place. It is something else, a gesture of a different order entirely, an act of transformation imposed on the landscape so dramatic that it would have been visible for miles in every direction, a fixed point around which an entire world could be oriented. Some researchers have proposed that the Grand Menhir Brise was the central element of a vast astronomical system, that it functioned as a universal foresight marker for tracking the movements of the moon across its complex 18-year cycle, visible from a series of other megalithic sites arranged around it at calculated distances. If this interpretation is correct, then the menhir was not merely a monument, it was an instrument, the centerpiece of a Neolithic observatory, on a scale that required generations of coordinated observation and construction to realize. The theory remains debated. The calculations are compelling. The counter-arguments are real. And the menhir itself cannot tell us which side is right. What we do know is that it fell. At some point, perhaps due to an earthquake, perhaps due to human intervention, the great stone toppled and broke into 4 pieces. And in its fall, something was redistributed. Fragments of the Grand Menhir Brise have been identified as the capstones of nearby passage tombs, including the Table des Marchands. The broken pieces of the greatest stone ever erected in prehistoric Europe were repurposed, incorporated into burial chambers, given new function in a new age. Was that an act of practicality? Or was it something more? A deliberate transformation of a broken sacred object into something that could still hold meaning. 7,000 years of weather have smoothed the edges of these stones. The carvings on the Table des Marchands capstone, those images made for no living eye, are still there, still visible to those who know to look. Someone made them in darkness, for reasons we cannot recover, and in the silence of that gesture, in the patient, invisible inscription on the underside of a stone that would be sealed away forever. There is something about the human relationship with the unseen that we have not yet found the right words to describe. We leave the Breton coast behind. We leave its broken giant lying in 4 pieces on the grass, its carved secrets sealed beneath 40 tons of stone, its questions drifting out over the Gulf of Morbihan like sea fog that never quite clears. We have been moving through a world that keeps presenting us with the same paradox. People who should not, by our conventional timelines, have possessed the knowledge, the organization, or the ambition to build what they built. And yet the stones remain, the alignments hold, the carvings endure. The evidence, patient and indifferent to our theories, simply waits. Now we move east, into the Balkans, into a landscape of mountains and river valleys and ancient crossroads where civilizations have been colliding and exchanging and dissolving into one another for longer than most of the world's famous monuments have existed. We are going to North Macedonia, and we are climbing. The mountain is called Tadichev Kamen. It rises above the village of Kokino in the northeastern part of the country, its rocky summit visible for miles across the surrounding hills. The terrain up here is volcanic, dark andesite rock, fractured and weathered, shaped by geological forces into a landscape that feels, even before you know its history, like somewhere that was chosen rather than merely found. At the top, the rock opens into a broad, natural platform, and carved into that platform, arranged across the volcanic stone with a deliberateness that becomes more apparent the longer you look, are the traces of a site that NASA has listed among the top 5 oldest observatories in the world. This is Kokino, and it is approximately 3,800 years old. It was rediscovered, because discovered implies it was ever entirely lost, by Macedonian archaeologist Jovica Stankovic in 2001. What he found was a site that had been hiding, in plain sight, on a mountaintop for nearly 4 millennia. The local people knew it was there. They had always known. But its true function, its true age, had not been formally documented. What Stankovic and subsequent researchers identified was a sophisticated astronomical observation site dating to approximately 1800 BC, placing it firmly in the Bronze Age, contemporary with the later phases of Stonehenge, with the Nuraghic civilization of Sardinia, with the earliest chapters of the civilizations we know by name. The site is organized around a series of stone thrones, large, seat-like formations carved or shaped from the natural rock, positioned along a lower platform that faces east. From these thrones, observers could track the rising points of the sun and moon against a distant ridge on the horizon, using specially carved markers cut into the rock at precise positions to record and predict astronomical events. The markers are the key, cut into the volcanic andesite with what must have been painstaking effort. They align with the rising positions of the sun at the summer and winter solstices and the equinoxes, and with specific points in the complex cycle of the moon. The precision of these alignments has been verified by modern astronomical calculation. They work. They worked then. They were designed to work by someone who understood the sky with a depth and consistency that required not individual genius, but accumulated generational observation. The mainstream interpretation is clear and well supported. Kokino was a Bronze Age astronomical observatory and ritual site. The stone throne suggests that observation was a formal, perhaps priestly act, that specific individuals sat in specific seats to watch the sky at specific times of year, and that what they saw informed the agricultural, religious, and social calendar of the surrounding community. Sky knowledge was power, the ability to predict the solstice, to announce the turning of the year, to know in advance when the moon would rise at a particular point on the horizon. These were not merely practical skills, they were sacred ones. But the site carries details that push beyond the straightforward. The thrones themselves are not simply functional, they are positioned with a care that goes beyond observation alone, arranged in a sequence that implies hierarchy, that suggests different seats held different significance, that the act of watching the sky at Kokino was bound up with social order, with rank, with the particular power of those who were permitted to sit in certain places and witness certain things. Who sat in these seats? What did they know that those who stood behind them did not? And what happened between the observations? What ceremonies? What recitations? What performances of knowledge filled the mountain air above those carved stone markers? The ceramic fragments and other artifacts recovered from Kokino suggest prolonged ritual use, that people returned here repeatedly, across generations, that the mountain was not simply a practical tool, but a living institution, a place that meant something beyond its function. Some researchers have pointed to the broader regional context and noted that Kokino sits within a landscape already rich with Bronze Age sacred sites, that it may have been one node in a wider network of astronomical and ceremonial locations connected by pathways and traditions we have only begun to trace. Others have asked a quieter question. The precision at Kokino, the accuracy of those carved markers, the sophistication of the lunar tracking they encode, implies a body of accumulated knowledge that did not arrive fully formed. Somewhere, in the centuries before 1800 BC, people in this landscape were watching the sky carefully enough, consistently enough, to build up the observational record that Kokino eventually crystallized into stone. Where's that earlier archive? What form did it take? And how much of it is simply not survived, carried in memory, in oral tradition, in wooden or textile or perishable forms that the earth did not preserve? The stone thrones of Kokino face east. They have faced east for nearly 4,000 years, waiting for observers who no longer come. But the sky they were built to read has not changed. The sun still rises at the same points on the solstices. The moon still traces the same patient cycle against the same horizon. The instrument still works. We have simply forgotten what we were supposed to be measuring. We descend from the mountain. We leave Kokino's stone thrones facing their eternal eastern horizon, leave the carved markers still pointing at a sky that has not forgotten what they were built to read, even if we have. And as we descend, something shifts in the nature of our inquiry. Because at Kokino we were looking at people tracking the sky, recording the movements of celestial bodies with a precision that implied systematic, accumulated knowledge. What we are about to encounter takes that impulse and expands it into something almost overwhelming in its scale. Not a single site, not a single structure or platform or enclosure, but a valley. An entire valley in the alpine foothills of northern Italy, whose rock surfaces have been used as a canvas for so long by so many hands, across so many generations, that the cumulative result is one of the largest collections of prehistoric art on Earth. We are going to Val Camonica, and we are going to try to read what was written there. The valley runs roughly north to south through the province of Brescia in Lombardy, carved by glacial action into the southern edge of the Alps. The Oglio River moves through it quietly. The valley walls rise steeply on either side, forested and rocky, their lower surfaces in many places composed of the smooth, glacially polished sandstone that became, for the people who lived here across thousands of years, an irresistible surface. They called what they did petroglyphs, from the Greek for rock carving. The people of Val Camonica left no name for it. They left only the images themselves, and the images number, by current estimates, between 140,000 and 300,000 individual figures carved across more than 2,400 documented rock surfaces. The range in that estimate is itself significant. There are so many that they have not yet all been counted. The earliest carvings date to approximately 8,000 BC, the Mesolithic period, when the glaciers had only recently retreated and the valley was being colonized by the first post-Ice Age human communities. The most recent date to the Roman period and beyond. That is a span of 10,000 years of continuous image-making on the same rock surfaces, in the same valley, by generation after generation of people who returned to these stones and added their marks to those left by their predecessors. 10,000 years. To put that in perspective, the entire span of recorded human history, from the first writing systems to the present day, is roughly 5,000 years. Val Camonica doubles that, in images alone, before a single written word existed anywhere on Earth. What did they carve? Everything. Deer and ibex and birds, rendered with the confident economy of people who observed animals closely and daily. Human figures, hunting, dancing, fighting, coupling, praying, standing in postures of authority or supplication that communicate across the millennia with unexpected directness. Weapons, tools, plows and carts marking the arrival of agriculture and then of animal traction. Geometric patterns whose meaning resists easy interpretation. Maps, or what appear to be maps, representations of fields, paths, and structures that some researchers have read as cadastral surveys, early attempts to record the ownership or organization of landscape. And then there are the figures that resist all easy categorization. Beings with antlered heads, figures whose proportions suggest not human bodies but something else, something larger, something that hovers at the boundary between the natural and the supernatural, in a way that archaeological language struggles to address without either overclaiming or underclaiming. The mainstream interpretation of Val Camonica treats it as a uniquely rich record of human cultural evolution in one specific place, a visual archive documenting the transition from hunter-gatherer societies to farming communities to the complex stratified cultures of the Bronze and Iron Ages. UNESCO recognized it in 1979 as one of the first World Heritage Sites, acknowledging its importance as a document of human prehistory without parallel in Europe. That recognition is entirely deserved, and it is still insufficient to capture what the valley actually contains. Because the cumulative effect of 10,000 years of image-making on the same surfaces creates something that transcends the individual carvings. Later, images were added beside earlier ones, sometimes overlapping them, sometimes seemingly responding to them, as though each generation was in conversation with those who came before, adding their chapter to a story that was never meant to end. Some rock surfaces are so densely carved that reading them requires hours of careful observation, the images layered and intersecting in ways that make the question of sequence, of meaning, of relationship between figures genuinely complex. Who decided which surfaces were appropriate for carving? Why were some rocks used repeatedly across millennia, while others nearby were left untouched? Was there a tradition of custodianship, a role passed down through generations, responsible for maintaining access to and understanding of the accumulated images? Some researchers have identified among the Val Camonica figures certain recurring symbols and forms that appear across multiple periods and cultures, images that seem to carry consistent meaning across thousands of years of use. The implications of that consistency are significant. It suggests not merely that people kept returning to the same valley, but that something was transmitted, some understanding of what the images meant, some tradition of interpretation, across a time span that dwarfs every civilization we typically study. There are those who have looked at the more enigmatic figures, the antlered beings, the geometrically precise patterns, the scenes that seem to depict altered states or visionary experiences, and proposed that shamanic practice was central to the valley's ritual life. That some of these images record not the visible world, but the interior world of people who crossed, deliberately and with cultural sanction, the boundary between ordinary consciousness and whatever lay beyond it. These proposals sit at the outer edge of academic consensus. They are not dismissed. They are simply unresolved, as so much of Val Camonica remains unresolved. The valley is still there. The stones are still covered in images. New ones are still being discovered, emerging from vegetation and soil, as researchers continue to document a site so vast that a single human lifetime is not enough to fully know it. 10,000 years of people looked at these same rocks and felt compelled to add their mark. What were they saying, and to whom? We leave the valley of images behind. We leave its 10,000 years of accumulated marks, its antlered figures and dancing humans and geometric patterns that no single lifetime is enough to fully read. We carry with us the question that Val Camonica pressed most insistently, not just what people were saying, but to whom, whether the audience for these inscriptions was ever entirely human. We move now, westward and south, down through the spine of Europe, across the Pyrenees, into the Iberian Peninsula, into Spain, and further south still into Andalusia, where the land grows drier and more austere, where the rivers cut through pale limestone hills, and where the particular quality of the light, hard, bright, merciless, seems to strip everything down to its essential form. In this landscape, on a narrow promontory above the confluence of two rivers near what is now the city of Almeria, the remains of something extraordinary have been slowly emerging from the earth since the late 19th century. Los Millares. It does not announce itself dramatically. The site sits quietly in the Andalusian interior, its low walls and circular tomb mounds blending into the surrounding terrain with the patience of things that have been waiting a very long time to be properly understood. But as the eye adjusts, as the scale of what is present begins to register, the quiet gives way to something more unsettling. This was a city, a planned, fortified, hydraulically sophisticated urban settlement, and it was built approximately 5,200 years ago. Los Millares dates to roughly 3200 BC, placing it at the threshold of what archaeologists call the Copper Age, the Chalcolithic period, when Iberian communities were beginning to smelt and work copper with a proficiency that would reshape the social and economic landscape of Western Europe. The site covers approximately 5 hectares of that narrow promontory, its occupation extending across several centuries of continuous habitation and expansion. What makes Los Millares immediately remarkable is its defensive architecture. The settlement is enclosed by a series of walls, not one, but at least 4 concentric lines of fortification, each equipped with bastions, projecting semicircular towers that would have allowed defenders to observe and engage attackers along the face of the wall. The outermost line of defense extends well beyond the main settlement. incorporating a system of smaller fortlets positioned on the surrounding hills. Outlying watchtowers, effectively, that extended the defensive perimeter of the site across the broader landscape. The sophistication of this defensive system is, by the standards of its time and place, extraordinary. Projecting bastions, that specific architectural solution, were not common in European prehistory at this date. They appear here, fully formed, in a Copper Age settlement in southern Spain, implying either independent architectural invention of considerable ingenuity or a degree of contact with more distant traditions that our current understanding of prehistoric exchange networks does not fully account for. Inside the walls, the settlement was organized with an urban logic that again exceeds comfortable expectation. Evidence of craft specialization, copper smelting, ivory working, the production of decorated pottery, suggests a community in which not everyone farmed, in which certain individuals or groups were dedicated to skilled production and presumably supported by the surplus generated by others. A social division of labor, an economy complex enough to sustain people whose work was not directly connected to feeding themselves. There was also water management. A system of channels and cisterns supplied the settlement with water, an infrastructure investment that implies planning, collective organization, and technical knowledge that we do not typically associate with Copper Age Iberia. The dead were buried outside the walls, and this is where Los Millares becomes most strange. Approximately 80 passage tombs, collective burial chambers approached through a long, stone-lined corridor, are distributed across the landscape surrounding the settlement. They are corbelled, their internal chambers roofed by the same technique we encountered in the Nuraghe Santu Antine on Sardinia. Rings of stone laid in gradually narrowing circles until they meet at the top. Each tomb held multiple individuals, interred with grave goods that speak of belief in an afterlife equipped with the same objects that made life meaningful: pottery, tools, weapons, ornaments. But it is the symbolism on the pottery and on the tomb walls that draws the sharpest attention. The oculus motif, a pair of eyes, stylized, rendered in a form that appears across Copper Age Iberia with remarkable consistency, stares out from ceramic vessels and stone plaques with an intensity that resists easy categorization. Are these the eyes of a deity? Of an ancestor? Of death itself, watching from the threshold between one world and the next? The mainstream interpretation connects the oculus symbol to a broader Iberian and indeed Atlantic tradition of eye-goddess iconography, a divine feminine principle associated with death and regeneration, whose gaze appears across funerary contexts from Portugal to the British Isles during this period. The tombs of Los Millares, this reading suggests, were not merely burial chambers, but interfaces, places where the living came to communicate with the dead, where the boundary between worlds was formally maintained and ritually crossed. That interpretation is compelling and well supported. It is also, in its quiet way, extraordinary, implying a cosmological framework of considerable sophistication, a theology of death and return that found its physical expression in 80 stone-built chambers arranged around a fortified, copper-working city in the Andalusian hills. Who governed Los Millares? The question does not have a clean answer. There is no palace, no single burial of overwhelming richness that announces a supreme ruler. The grave goods, while varied, do not show the extreme stratification we associate with later Bronze Age chiefdoms. And yet the coordination required to build those walls, those fortlets, those water channels, those 80 passage tombs, that coordination implies authority of some kind, concentrated somewhere, exercised over a community of considerable size. Some researchers have proposed that religious authority and political authority were not yet separated at Los Millares, that whoever controlled access to the tombs, Whoever mediated between the living community and its accumulated dead held the organizing power that built the walls and managed the water and directed the copper smelters. The eyes on the pottery watched all of it. They watch still, from museum cases, from the stone plaques recovered in excavation, from the tomb walls where they were placed to guard or welcome, or simply to see. What did those eyes represent to the people who painted them? What did it mean to be watched by them in the darkness of a corbelled chamber, with the dead arranged around you and the copper city going about its business outside? The eyes of Los Millares are still open. Whatever they were looking for, they have not yet looked away. Those open eyes follow us as we leave Andalusia. They follow us north, away from the dry hills and the corbelled tombs and the copper-working city that should not have existed when it did. We carry them with us, that image of watchful, stylized eyes on pottery and stone, placed there by people who believed that the dead continued to see, that the divine continued to observe, that the act of being witnessed by something beyond the ordinary world mattered enough to carve it into the walls of chambers built for eternity. We are moving backward now, further back than we have gone on this entire journey, back past the Copper Age, past the Neolithic, past the Bronze Age monuments and the megalithic tombs and the astronomical observatories. Back into a period so remote that the very landscape of Europe looked different. Colder, flatter, the great ice sheets pressing down from the north, the megafauna still moving across a continent that would not be recognizable to modern eyes. We are going to the Ice Age, to the Moravian lowlands of what is now the Czech Republic, to a site along the DJ River where the land is flat and the winters are cold, and where roughly 29,000 years ago, human beings were doing something that no one expected them to be doing. This is Dolní Věstonice, and it is about to change the way we think about when human creativity truly began. The site was first excavated in the 1920s, and what emerged from the frozen earth of Moravia was so unexpected, so chronologically disorienting, that it took decades for the full implications to settle into the academic imagination. Because Dolní Věstonice is not a Neolithic settlement or a Bronze Age ceremonial complex. It is a Gravettian hunter-gatherer encampment, a temporary, or perhaps semi-permanent, base camp used by people who followed the mammoth herds across the Moravian plain during one of the coldest periods in the last ice age. These were not farmers, not city builders, not people with metal tools or domesticated animals, or any of the markers we typically associate with cultural complexity. And yet, they were making fired ceramic figurines 29,000 years ago. Let that settle for a moment. The deliberate firing of clay, the transformation of raw earth into a permanent, hardened form through the controlled application of heat, is a process we associate with the Neolithic Revolution, with the emergence of pottery as a technology that enabled food storage and sedentary life. The earliest pottery in the conventional timeline dates to roughly 18,000 to 20,000 years ago in East Asia. Functional ceramic vessels, the kind used for storage and cooking, become widespread in Europe only around 6,000 to 7,000 BC. Dolní Věstonice predates all of that by thousands of years, not with vessels, not with practical containers, but with figurines, with art. The most famous of these is the Venus of Dolní Věstonice, a small female figure, barely 11 centimeters tall, modeled from a mixture of clay and crushed mammoth bone, and fired in a kiln or hearth at temperatures carefully controlled enough to harden the figure without destroying it. She is not unique. Hundreds of fragments of fired animal and human figurines have been recovered from the site. Lions, bears, mammoths, foxes, owls, and multiple female figures, suggesting not an isolated experiment but a sustained practice, a tradition of ceramic image-making that was already sophisticated by the time the archaeological record captures it. The kiln itself, a domed clay structure capable of reaching and maintaining the temperatures necessary to fire ceramic objects, was found at the site. A 29,000-year-old kiln, built by people who, in the conventional narrative, were supposed to be too busy surviving the Ice Age to develop industrial processes. The mainstream interpretation acknowledges all of this and frames it within the broader phenomenon of the Upper Paleolithic creative explosion, that remarkable period, beginning roughly 40,000 years ago, during which fully modern human beings began producing art, music, personal ornamentation, and symbolic objects with a suddenness and sophistication that still generates debate about its causes. Dolní Věstonice, this reading suggests, represents an early and particularly remarkable flowering of that creativity, a community of Ice Age hunter-gatherers who had developed specialized knowledge of pyrotechnology and were applying it to the production of symbolic objects. That interpretation is carefully grounded, and it still leaves the most interesting questions unanswered. Why figurines? Why, of all the possible applications for the discovery that clay hardens in fire, did the people of Dolní Věstonice choose image-making as their primary use? The practical applications, waterproof containers, cooking vessels, were presumably available to them as insights. They did not pursue them, or at least the evidence does not show it. They made animals. They made women. They made forms that meant something, that carried symbolic weight heavy enough to justify the effort of building a kiln and mastering a firing process that even modern ceramicists recognize as technically demanding. What did those forms mean? The Venus figurines of the Upper Paleolithic, found across a vast swath of Europe and Asia from the same general period, have been interpreted as fertility symbols, as goddess figures, as self-portraits, as teaching tools, as tokens of social exchange. No single interpretation has prevailed. The figures are too varied, too widely distributed, too chronologically persistent to reduce to a single function. There is one burial at Dolní Věstonice that stops every researcher who encounters it. 3 individuals, buried together beneath mammoth shoulder blades. 2 males flanking a central figure, the central figure's sex ambiguous or deliberately obscured in death. The body of the central individual was sprinkled with ochre and covered with the shoulder blade of a mammoth. Near the head, a small ceramic figurine was placed, the only instance at the site of a figurine deliberately interred with a human being. Who was this person? What was their role in the community that made it appropriate or necessary to bury them flanked by 2 others, covered in red, accompanied by a fired clay image made from the earth of the Moravian plain? The ochre used to cover them, that deliberate reddening of a body in death, appears in burials across the ancient world, from this period forward, for tens of thousands of years. It meant something. It meant something consistent enough that people kept doing it across continents and millennia, long after any memory of its origin could have survived. What did red mean at the edge of the Ice Age, in the dark of a Moravian winter? What did it mean to shape a woman from clay, fire her in a kiln, and place her beside your dead? The Venus of Dolní Věstonice sits in a museum in Brno today. 11 centimeters of fired clay, 29,000 years old, her features worn smooth by time. She has been looked at by more people than she was ever made to reach, and she has not yet given up what she was made to mean. She has not given up what she was made to mean, and perhaps that is fitting, because as we leave the Ice Age behind, as we move forward through the millennia, out of the cold of Moravia and into a warming world, we find that the impulse she represents does not diminish. It grows, it organizes. It reaches outward from the individual object, from the single fired figurine placed beside a single body in a single grave, and becomes something collective. Something built not by one pair of hands, but by hundreds, by generations. The question that Dolní Věstonice pressed most insistently: why do human beings feel compelled to make sacred form from the material of the earth? And what do they do with that compulsion when they gather in communities? Finds one of its most complex and beautiful answers in a place most people have never heard of. We move west, to the Iberian Peninsula, to Portugal, to the interior plateau known as the Alentejo, a vast, gently rolling landscape of cork oaks and golden grasses and pale red soil, where the light in summer is so intense it seems to flatten everything beneath it, and where the silence is the particular silence of land that has been farmed and lived on and returned to for so long that it has absorbed all the noise and kept it. Here, in the municipality of Reguengos de Monserrat, not far from the Spanish border, a site has been emerging from that red Alentejo soil since the 1990s, with a complexity and a scale that has steadily redrawn the map of European prehistory. This is Perdigões. From the air, if you know what you're looking at, the concentric rings become visible, circular ditches cut into the bedrock, one inside the other, the outermost enclosure spanning nearly 300 meters in diameter. The rings are not perfectly uniform. They were not all built at once. What you are seeing from above is the accumulated result of construction, modification, expansion, and reuse across a period of roughly 1,500 years, from approximately 3,400 to 2000 BC, 1,500 years. The same duration separates us from the early medieval period, from the world of Charlemagne and the Tang dynasty and the early Islamic Caliphate. To sustain a sacred site in continuous active use for that span of time requires not just belief, but institutional memory, a tradition of transmission that carried the meaning and purpose of this place from one generation to the next without interruption, across 60 or 70 human lifetimes. The ditches themselves were not defensive. This is one of the first and most important things researchers established. They are too wide and too shallow to function as fortifications, and the evidence from their interiors makes their purpose clear. They were filled, repeatedly and deliberately, with material: animal bones, human remains, pottery, charred plant matter, objects of personal ornament, deposited in a pattern that speaks of ritual rather than refuse. Things were placed here with intention. Things were returned to the earth at Perdigões as part of a practice that was repeated, modified, and sustained across centuries. The human remains are particularly significant. Bones from multiple individuals, often disarticulated, often showing signs of having been moved after an initial burial elsewhere, were deposited in the ditches in ways that suggest complex funerary practices extending well beyond simple interment. Bodies were buried, then exhumed. Specific bones were selected and relocated. The dead were not merely disposed of at Perdigões, they were curated, managed, kept in relationship with the living community through a set of practices that we do not yet fully understand, but cannot reduce to anything simple. There were also cremations. The combination of inhumation and cremation within the same enclosure, across the same extended period, suggests either a community that practiced both simultaneously, perhaps for different individuals or different social categories, or a tradition that evolved over time, one practice giving way to or coexisting with another as the centuries passed. The mainstream interpretation frames Perdigões as a ditched enclosure, a type of monument found across Western and Central Europe during the Neolithic and Copper Age, generally understood as communal gathering places serving religious, funerary, and perhaps economic functions for the surrounding population. The scale and duration of Perdigões places it among the most significant examples of this monument type on the Iberian Peninsula, and the richness of its archaeological deposits has made it one of the most intensively studied prehistoric sites in Portugal. That framework is solid, and within it, the questions multiply. Who came to Perdigões? Isotopic analysis of human remains from the site has revealed something striking, that not all of the individuals buried here were local. Some show isotopic signatures consistent with origins in different regions, suggesting that Perdigões drew people from a considerable geographic range. It was not simply the burial ground of a single community. It was something more like a destination, a place that people traveled to, perhaps seasonally, perhaps for specific ceremonies, from across a wide area of the Iberian interior. What drew them? What happened here that was worth the journey? The animal bones found in the ditches offer a partial answer. The species represented, cattle, sheep, pigs, and the way they were deposited suggest large-scale communal feasting, the kind of event that requires coordination, surplus, and a shared understanding of occasion. People came here together, ate together, buried their dead together, and returned to the earth the material evidence of all of it. There is also evidence of craft production and exchange. Objects found at Perdigões, worked ivory, decorated ceramics, copper items in the later phases, connect the site to wider networks of material exchange that stretched across the Iberian Peninsula and beyond. The people who gathered here were not isolated. They were connected, through trade and perhaps through kinship and certainly through shared ritual practice, to communities across a broad and active prehistoric world. Some researchers have noted astronomical alignments in the orientation of the enclosure's entrances, sightlines toward the rising and setting points of the sun at significant moments in the solar year. If these alignments were intentional, and the evidence suggests they may have been, then Perdigões was not only a gathering place and a burial ground, but a device for marking time, for connecting the human community to the rhythms of the sky in a way that made the passage of the year legible and sacred. The Alentejo light falls on Perdigões now, as it always has. The cork oaks stand in their scattered way across the plateau. The red soil gives nothing away, but somewhere beneath it, in those carefully filled ditches, in the arranged bones of people who were brought here from distant places and returned to the earth with deliberate ceremony, there is a record of something that mattered enormously to the people who created it. What was worth traveling for in the Copper Age Alentejo? What happened inside those concentric rings that was sacred enough to sustain, without interruption, for 1,500 years? We leave the Alentejo behind. We leave its red soil and its concentric ditches and its 1,500 years of accumulated ceremony. Its bones arranged with intention. Its people who traveled from distant places to gather inside those rings for reasons that the earth has absorbed and will not easily return. And as we leave, something clarifies. Because across this entire journey, from the burned circles of Arkaim to the rings of Perdigões, from the circular plaza of Sechin Bajo to the corbelled chambers of Los Millares, we have kept returning to the same form, the circle, closed, self-referential, without beginning or end, enclosing a space that is defined not by what is inside it, but by the act of enclosure itself. We have asked at each stop what the circle meant. We have not yet found a single answer. Perhaps we are about to find another version of the question, asked in a landscape so dramatically suited to it that the asking feels almost inevitable. We are going to England's Lake District, to Cumbria, to a high open plateau between the mountains where the sky is enormous and the horizon is ringed in every direction by fells that rise and fall with the particular unhurried drama of very old landscape. On that plateau, arranged in a rough circle on the grass, 38 stones stand in a silence that the mountains around them seem to actively maintain. This is Castlerigg, and it may be the most atmospherically powerful prehistoric monument in Britain. It does not have the scale of Stonehenge. It does not have the elaborate tomb architecture of Newgrange. What it has, what it possesses in a way that is almost impossible to convey through description and must simply be experienced, is placement. Whoever chose this location understood something profound about the relationship between a human-made form and the natural landscape surrounding it. The circle sits on a slight rise, ensuring visibility in all directions. The mountains, Helvellyn, Blencathra, the Skiddaw Massif, form a natural amphitheater around it, their profiles creating a skyline that is both enclosing and vast. Standing inside the circle, you are simultaneously contained and exposed. Held within the ring of stones and within the ring of mountains, the human geometry nested inside the geological one. It was built approximately 3,200 BC, making it among the earliest stone circles in Britain, potentially older than the first phase of Stonehenge, older than Avebury, older than almost every monument of its type on the island. Its stones are not dressed or shaped. They are local Borrowdale volcanic rock, chosen from the surrounding landscape, their irregular forms arranged with a care that reveals itself gradually rather than immediately. The circle is not perfectly circular. It is slightly flattened on one side, a feature shared with many British stone circles that has prompted decades of debate about whether this reflects astronomical intention, practical constraint, or symbolic meaning. Inside the main ring, on the eastern side, 10 additional stones form a rectangular enclosure, a feature unique to Castlerigg, its purpose unknown. It is too small to be a building, too carefully arranged to be accidental, too singular to be explained by reference to other sites. What was that inner rectangle for? Who stood inside it or placed objects within it? And why? The mainstream interpretation of Castlerigg places it within the broader context of Neolithic ceremonial activity in the Lake District, a region that was, during this period, surprisingly densely populated and culturally active. The Langdale axe factories, located in the mountains visible from the circle, were producing polished stone axes that have been found across Britain and Ireland. Objects traded far beyond their place of manufacture, their value presumably connected as much to their origin in these specific mountains as to their practical utility. Castlerigg, this reading suggests, may have been a gathering place connected to that trade network, a neutral meeting ground where communities came together seasonally to exchange goods, negotiate relationships, and perform shared ceremonies. That interpretation is economically and socially plausible, and it sits alongside something harder to quantify. The astronomical alignments at Castlerigg have been studied extensively. Researchers have identified sightlines from specific stones toward the rising points of the sun at the solstices and equinoxes, and toward significant lunar events, using the mountain profiles on the horizon as natural markers in ways that recall, at a landscape scale, the carved markers of Kokino. The surrounding fells were not merely a backdrop, they were part of the instrument. If the people who built Castlerigg were using the mountain skyline as a celestial calendar, and the evidence, while not conclusive, is serious enough to be taken seriously, then the placement of the circle was not arbitrary. It was calculated. The specific plateau, the specific orientation, the specific sightlines available from that precise location were selected because they made the circle work as an observational tool embedded in the natural landscape. And that would require a level of prior survey, of accumulated sky watching, of deliberate site selection that implies an intellectual tradition of considerable depth operating in the Lake District 5,000 years ago. There are those who go further, who note that Castlerigg sits within a landscape dense with other prehistoric monuments, cairns, enclosures, standing stones, the axe factory sites in the high fells, and propose that the entire region functioned as a sacred landscape, a coherent ceremonial geography in which Castlerigg was the ceremonial center, the place where the threads of meaning running through the surrounding landscape converged. Some have noted the particular acoustic properties of the site, the way sound behaves within the ring of stones and the ring of mountains, the way voices carry and sounds reflect, and the circle seems in certain conditions to function as a natural amplifier. Whether this was noticed and exploited by the people who built Castlerigg, whether ceremony here involved sound as deliberately as it involved sight, is a question that acoustic archaeology is only beginning to have the tools to address. What we know is that people came here repeatedly. The ground has yielded evidence of activity, of presence, of the quiet residue of human gathering across an extended period. They came, they did what they came to do, and they left. And then they came again. The stones were not roofed. There was no shelter. Whatever happened at Castlerigg happened in full exposure to the Lake District sky, the rain, the wind, the particular northern light that makes colors more saturated than they have any right to be. The mountains are still there. The stones are still in their places, 38 of them on that high plateau, the rectangle still sitting inside the circle like a question inside a question. 5,000 years of Lake District weather have moved across them without moving them. Whatever held this place together, whatever meaning was strong enough to make people carry those stones up to that plateau and set them with such care against such a horizon, it was stronger than 5 millennia of rain. What could that possibly have been? We leave the Lake District behind. We leave Castlerigg's 38 stones standing in their circle on that high Cumbrian plateau, the mountains holding them in their ancient amphitheater, the rectangle inside the circle still asking its unanswered question at the heart of the ring. We have spent much of this journey in Europe, moving through its megalithic traditions, its stone circles and passage tombs and corbelled towers, its valleys of carved rock and its ditched enclosures filled with the carefully arranged bones of the deliberately remembered dead. Europe is dense with prehistory. It rewards this kind of slow, attentive movement. But the ancient world was not Europe alone, and some of its most disorienting revelations are waiting on the other side of the Atlantic, in a landscape so different from the green hills and gray stones of Britain that the contrast itself becomes part of the story. We return to Peru, to that narrow strip of coastal desert we visited earlier in our journey, where the Pacific meets the Andes and almost nothing grows, and the dry air preserves, with extraordinary fidelity, the evidence of what human beings were doing here when most of the rest of the world was still, by conventional reckoning, in the earliest stages of organized complexity. We visited Sechin Bajo earlier, that inland site in the Casma Valley whose circular plaza dated to 3500 BC and rewrote the timeline of American civilization. Now we move to the coast itself, to the edge of the ocean, to a low mound of ruins rising from the desert just above the mouth of the Supa River, where the Pacific wind moves through the ruins of something that was already ancient when Egypt was young. This is Aspero, and it is one of the oldest urban ceremonial centers ever found in the Americas. The site sits on a rocky promontory above the Pacific, close enough to the ocean that the sound of the surf would have been a constant presence for the people who lived and worked and gathered here. The landscape is austere, pale desert, gray ocean, the bare profiles of coastal hills rising inland. There is no shade, no softness. The light is relentless and the wind is persistent, and yet this is where they chose to build. Aspero belongs to the Norte Chico civilization, that same remarkable cultural fluorescence we encountered at Sechin Bajo, now increasingly recognized as the oldest complex society in the Americas. It dates to approximately 3000 BC, with evidence of occupation and construction activity extending across several centuries. And what was built here, on this windswept coastal promontory, is not modest. The site contains at least 7 large platform mounds, stepped pyramidal structures built from stone and filled with a material that has become one of the most discussed details in Andean archaeology. The fill inside these mounds consists largely of shikra bags, woven mesh bags made from plant fiber, each one packed with stones and stacked inside the platform structure as a construction unit. The shikra bag system is elegant in its logic. Rather than organizing a labor force to move loose stone in an uncontrolled way, the builders of Aspero created a modular construction system, each bag a discrete unit of effort, traceable, accountable, perhaps even associated with a specific individual, family, or community group who contributed it. Some researchers have proposed that the bags represent a form of labor tax or communal contribution, a physical record of collective investment in a shared sacred project. If that interpretation is correct, then the platform mounds of Aspero are not merely architectural achievements. They are social documents, three-dimensional records of the community effort that built them, the labor of individual human beings literally built into the fabric of the structure in a form that has survived 5,000 years. The largest mound at Aspero, known as Huaca de los Ídolos, the Shrine of the Idols, rises to a height of approximately 10 meters and covers an area of roughly 3,000 square meters. Its summit platform contained evidence of ritual activity, offerings, carefully placed objects, the residue of ceremonies performed at elevation above the surrounding landscape. The second major mound, Huaca de los Sacrificios, the Shrine of the Sacrifices, takes its name from the discovery within it of infant burials, interred with grave goods in a manner suggesting deliberate, formal sacrifice rather than simple burial. The name is confronting. The practice it references is disturbing to modern sensibilities, but it connects Aspero to a pattern of ritual behavior, the offering of the most profound gift available, the return of new life to whatever powers were believed to govern the continuation of the world, that appears across ancient cultures with a frequency that demands serious rather than dismissive engagement. What were the people of Aspero asking for when they made these offerings at the summit of their mounds? What did they believe governed the sea they depended on, the fish that fed them, the anchovy schools that made their civilization possible? The mainstream interpretation of Aspero frames it as the maritime counterpart to the inland ceremonial centers of the Norte Chico, a coastal hub in a network of sites connected by the exchange of goods and the sharing of ritual tradition. The fishing communities of the coast supplied protein to the inland agricultural communities. The inland communities supplied cotton and other agricultural products to the coast. Aspero, this reading suggests, was where the coastal side of that exchange was organized and sacralized, where the relationship between the sea and the land, between the fishermen and the farmers, was maintained through ceremony and offering. That framework is persuasive, and it raises a question that the evidence at Aspero presses with particular force. A recent discovery at the site has added an entirely new dimension to our understanding of it. In 2019, archaeologists uncovered the burial of a high-status individual, a woman, interred with remarkable grave goods, including a headdress, a necklace, and objects that clearly signal social distinction. She has been called, in the press coverage that followed, the Lady of the Four Tupus after the pins found with her. Her existence challenges older assumptions about Norte Chico society, assumptions that had imagined it as relatively egalitarian, organized around collective religious authority rather than individual status. She suggests something more complex, a society in which certain individuals accumulated distinction, in which gender and power intersected in ways we are only beginning to trace. Who was she? What did she govern, or mediate, or represent? What was her relationship to the mound she was buried near, to the ceremonies performed on their summits, to the ocean that defined the world her community inhabited? The Pacific still moves against the promontory where Aspero stands. The wind still comes off the water with that same insistent, salt-laden persistence. And somewhere in the ruins of those platform mounds, in the shikra bags still packed with stones inside them, in the grave of a woman whose status outlasted her name by 5,000 years, there is a society we have only just begun to see clearly. What else is still inside those mounds waiting for the right question to draw it out? We leave Peru behind. We leave the windswept promontory of Aspero and its platform mounds packed with shikra bags, its Lady of the Four Tupus still holding her unanswered questions in the dry coastal air. We carry with us the image that has followed us across this entire journey, of communities organizing enormous collective effort around something sacred, something that required the labor of generations and the belief of thousands, and the kind of sustained institutional memory that we rarely assign to the peoples we call prehistoric. We cross the Atlantic once more, back to Europe, back to that ancient, monument-dense landscape of western France that we passed through earlier, when we stood before the broken giant of Locmariaquer and tried to comprehend what it meant to move 280 tons of granite across 4 kilometers of Breton countryside and raise it toward the sky. We are still in Brittany. We have not moved far geographically, but we have moved into a different chapter of the same long story, a chapter that begins not with a standing stone but with a hill that is not a hill. The town of Carnac sits on the southern coast of Brittany in the Morbihan department, where the gulf of that name opens into the Atlantic with a quiet complexity of islands and inlets and tidal passages that gives the coastline an almost labyrinthine quality. Carnac is famous as prehistoric landscapes go. It is the site of the most extensive alignment of standing stones in the world. Thousands of menhirs arranged in parallel rows that stretch across the landscape for kilometers in a pattern whose full meaning remains, after 2 centuries of study, genuinely open. But it is not the alignments we are here for today. On the eastern edge of Carnac, rising above the town with the quiet authority of something that has always been there, stands a mound. A large mound. A mound so large that for centuries the people of Carnac built on top of it. A chapel was constructed at its summit in the 17th century, a chapel that still stands, giving the mound the appearance, from a distance, of a small hill crowned by a church. It is not a hill, it is the Tumulus Saint-Michel, and it is one of the largest burial mounds in Western Europe. The dimensions alone require a moment of adjustment. The tumulus stretches approximately 125 meters in length, 60 meters in width, and rises to a height of roughly 12 meters. Its volume has been estimated at around 35,000 cubic meters of earth, stone, and fill, material that was quarried, carried, and deposited here by human hands, basket by basket and stone by stone, over a period of construction that archaeologists believe extended across generations rather than years. It was built approximately 5000 BC. That date places the Tumulus Saint-Michel among the oldest monumental structures in the world, older than the pyramids of Egypt by more than 1500 years, older than Stonehenge in any of its phases, contemporary with the very earliest experiments in monumental architecture that human beings were undertaking anywhere on Earth. The people who built it were Neolithic farmers and fishermen, inhabitants of the same Breton coastal landscape that would, over the following millennia, produce the stone rows of Carnac and the great menhirs of Locmariaquer and the passage tombs of the Morbihan, with a consistency and an ambition that makes this corner of France one of the most remarkable concentrations of prehistoric monumentality anywhere in the world. At the heart of the tumulus, excavations carried out primarily in the 19th and early 20th centuries revealed a central chamber, a stone-built burial space containing the remains of what appears to have been a single high-status individual, interred with an assemblage of grave goods that immediately communicated the importance of the person placed there. Axes, not ordinary axes, polished stone axes of exceptional quality, some made from materials sourced from distant regions of France and beyond. dozens of them, placed with the body in a deliberate arrangement that speaks of ritual significance rather than practical provision. Alongside them, beads, pendants, and ornaments, objects of personal adornment whose materials and craftsmanship place them among the finest known examples of Neolithic decorative production. The axes deserve particular attention. In Neolithic Western Europe, the polished stone axe was not merely a tool. It was a prestige object, a symbol of status, a material embodiment of social distinction that was traded across enormous distances and accumulated by individuals and communities of particular standing. The concentration of exceptional axes in the central chamber of the tumulus Saint-Michel suggests that whoever was buried here commanded access to exchange networks of considerable geographic reach, that this individual's influence, or the influence of the community that built this monument for them, extended far beyond the coastline of southern Brittany. The mainstream interpretation frames the tumulus as a chieftain's burial, the interment of a powerful individual whose social prominence was expressed in death through both the richness of the grave goods placed with them and the monumental scale of the structure built above them. This reading connects the tumulus Saint-Michel to a broader pattern of elite burial in Neolithic Atlantic Europe, in which the construction of large mounds over individual or small group interments served simultaneously as an act of commemoration, a territorial marker, and a demonstration of the social power required to mobilize the labor that building such a structure demanded. That interpretation is well-grounded, and it opens rather than closes the questions that matter most. Because the labor required to build the tumulus Saint-Michel was not modest. 35,000 cubic meters of fill, moved and deposited across a period of perhaps decades or even longer, that represents an investment of collective human effort on a scale that raises immediate questions about the society that undertook it. Who could command that labor? What form did that authority take in a society that had no writing, no metal, no formal state apparatus as we understand it? The 19th century excavations were thorough for their time, but destructive by modern standards. Much of what the tumulus contained, the stratigraphic information that would allow us to understand the sequence of its construction, the organic materials that might have told us about the rituals performed here, was lost in the process of recovery. What we have is an outline, a powerful, suggestive outline, but an outline nonetheless. There are subsidiary chambers within the tumulus beyond the central burial, smaller stone-built spaces that contained additional grave goods and perhaps additional burials, though the early excavations make it difficult to be certain. The presence of these subsidiary chambers raises the possibility that the tumulus was not built for a single interment, but was used across an extended period, its interior growing more complex as generations returned to add to it. Some researchers have pointed to the alignment of the tumulus and the orientation of its central chamber in relation to solar events, specifically the rising sun at significant points in the agricultural year. If those alignments were intentional, then the choice of this particular location, the orientation of the entire enormous structure, was determined not only by the topography of the Karnak landscape, but by the movement of the sun above it. The dead within the tumulus were not merely buried. They were positioned in relationship to the sky. The connection to the nearby Karnak alignments has also attracted sustained attention. The stone rows that made Karnak famous, those thousands of standing stones arranged in parallel lines stretching across the landscape to the north and west, are roughly contemporary with the tumulus in their earliest phases, and both monument types have been found across the same broad landscape. Some researchers have proposed that the tumulus and the alignments were elements of a single integrated sacred landscape, that the stone rows were processional routes leading toward or away from the burial mound, that the living moved through the alignments in ceremonies oriented around the dead interred in the great mound on the edge of town. That proposal remains speculative. The evidence does not confirm it, but it does not contradict it either. And standing at the base of the Tumulus Saint-Michel, looking up at the chapel that sits on its summit, like a later civilization's attempt to reclaim or redirect the sacred power of the place, the idea of procession feels intuitively right. This was somewhere people moved toward, somewhere that gathered meaning from the approach. The chapel of Saint-Michel was built here deliberately. The 17th century Bretons who placed a Christian structure at the summit of a pagan mound knew, at some level, that this was a place that had always held power, that the elevation, the visibility, the particular presence of this spot in the landscape was not incidental but essential. They were claiming it, as so many had before them. What was the name of the person buried in that central chamber, 5,000 years before the chapel was built above them? What did their community believe about where they were going, and what they would need when they got there? The axes placed beside them have outlasted every answer. They sit in museum cases now, polished and silent, far from the Breton coast, where they were made and traded and finally given back to the earth. They were placed there with enormous care by people who believed the gesture mattered. We are still trying to understand why. We leave Brittany behind. We leave the Tumulus Saint-Michel, with its chapel sitting on 5,000 years of accumulated sacred weight, its polished axes silent in their museum cases, its central chamber holding the outline of a person whose name the earth swallowed completely. We have been moving across this entire journey through a world that keeps surprising us, a world in which the people we call prehistoric, a word that carries, despite our best intentions, a faint suggestion of the simple, the primitive, the not yet fully formed, keep revealing themselves as something more complex, more organized, more thoughtful than the label allows. They watched the sky with precision. They moved stones that challenge our engineering. They buried their dead with a care that implies rich and sophisticated belief. They built circles and mounds and platforms and enclosures and filled them with meaning that persisted, in some cases, for 15 centuries without interruption. Now we travel east again, far east, to the banks of the Shan River in what is now the Shanxi province of central China, to a city, and it was a city, in every sense that matters, that was thriving while the Tumulus Saint-Michel was still being built, while the stone rows of Karnak were being laid out across the Breton landscape, while the Neolithic world of Western Europe was reaching the first peak of its monumental ambition. This is Banpo, and it is one of the most completely excavated Neolithic settlements ever found anywhere on Earth. The site was discovered in 1953 during construction work near the city of Xi'an, a city that would later become famous as the home of the Terracotta Army, a reminder that this particular stretch of the Wei River Valley has been generating archaeological revelations for as long as anyone has been digging. What the construction workers uncovered, and what the subsequent decades of careful excavation revealed, was a Neolithic village of remarkable completeness. A settlement preserved beneath the alluvial deposits of centuries in a state that allowed archaeologists to reconstruct, with unusual fidelity, the details of daily life along the Chan River approximately 6,500 years ago. Banpo belonged to the Yangshao culture, a Neolithic tradition that flourished across the Yellow River Valley roughly between 5000 and 3000 BC, characterized by a distinctive painted pottery, by settled agricultural villages, and by a social organization that the evidence at Banpo allows us to examine more closely than almost anywhere else from this period. The settlement covered approximately 5 hectares, a substantial area, home at its peak to perhaps 500 or 600 people, though some estimates go higher. It was organized with a deliberateness that immediately announces itself. A deep defensive ditch, roughly 6 meters wide and 5 meters deep, enclosed the residential area, a boundary between the village and the surrounding landscape that was clearly intended to define and protect the community within. Inside that ditch, the houses were arranged around a large central building, a communal structure considerably bigger than the individual dwellings, whose function has been the subject of sustained debate, but which most researchers interpret as a meeting hall, a gathering space, a place where the community came together for decisions and perhaps for ceremonies. The individual houses were semi-subterranean, partially sunk into the earth, their floors below ground level in a design that provided insulation against the temperature extremes of the central Chinese climate. They were circular or rectangular, built from timber frames with walls of wattle and daub, their hearths at the center, their entrances oriented consistently toward the south, a detail that speaks of shared cultural convention, of an agreed-upon relationship between domestic space and the directions of the compass that was maintained across the entire settlement. The pottery found at Banpo is among the most discussed material from the Yangshao culture. Painted in red and black with geometric patterns, spirals, zigzags, chevrons, nets, it is visually striking and technically accomplished, the work of people with a fully developed ceramic tradition. But it is certain marks found on the pottery that have generated the most sustained and sometimes heated academic debate. On the rims and bases of pottery vessels from Banpo, researchers have found a series of incised symbols, simple marks individually, but comprising a set of perhaps 20 or more distinct signs that appear repeatedly across the assemblage. They are not purely decorative. They are too consistent, too deliberately placed, too systematically varied to be ornament. Some researchers have proposed that they represent a primitive writing system, or more precisely, the kind of proto-writing that precedes and potentially prefigures true writing, a symbolic notation system that encoded information of some kind in a form that could be recognized and read by those who knew the code. If that interpretation is correct, the Banpo symbols would push the origins of symbolic notation in China back to approximately 4500 BC, roughly 2,000 years before the earliest oracle bone inscriptions of the Shang dynasty that are conventionally identified as the beginning of Chinese writing. The mainstream response to this proposal is cautious. Most scholars stop short of calling the Banpo symbols writing, preferring terms like potter's marks or ownership symbols, signs made by individual potters to identify their work, or by households to mark their vessels. That interpretation is conservative and defensible. It is also, arguably, not as different from proto-writing as it might seem. The line between a systematic marking system used to encode identity and ownership and a writing system used to encode language is one that humanity has crossed multiple times, in multiple places, and the crossing is rarely clean or sudden. What were the people of Banpo communicating, and to whom, when they pressed those marks into wet clay before firing? The burial ground at Banpo sits outside the residential ditch. The dead, as at so many of the sites we have visited, kept in a defined relationship with the living, present but separated, accessible but bounded. The burials reveal something about Yangshao society that has been the subject of considerable interpretive effort. In the earliest phases of the site, men and women appear to have been buried with roughly equal status, their grave goods not dramatically differentiated by sex. In later phases, some researchers have detected a shift, a gradual increase in the differentiation of burial wealth, a tentative emergence of the kind of status distinctions that would become more pronounced in later Chinese cultures. Was Banpo an egalitarian society in transition? Were the people buried in its cemetery living through the early stages of a social transformation that would, over the following millennia, produce the hierarchical civilizations of the Yellow River Valley? The question matters because Banpo is not simply an archaeological site. It is, in the imagination of Chinese archaeology and Chinese national identity, a kind of origin point, a window into the deep roots of a civilization that would become one of the most continuous and consequential in human history. The Banpo Museum, built over and around the excavation site in Xi'an, was one of the first site museums in China, opened in 1958 as a deliberate statement about the depth and sophistication of Chinese prehistoric culture. That cultural weight is real and significant, and it has shaped, in ways that archaeologists are careful to acknowledge, some of the interpretive frameworks applied to the site. The desire to see in Banpo the origins of Chinese civilization, its writing, its social organization, its relationship with the land, is understandable and not entirely misplaced. But it also requires careful handling, a distinction between what the evidence shows and what the evidence is being asked to show. What it shows, clearly and without interpretive strain, is a community of several hundred people living in organized, permanent settlement along the Chan River 6,500 years ago, farming millet, fishing the river, keeping pigs and dogs, making pottery of considerable artistic sophistication, burying their dead with care, and marking their objects with signs that meant something to the people who made them and received them. It shows a community with a center, that large communal building around which the houses were arranged, that gravitational point of collective life, whose precise function we cannot recover, but whose importance the spatial organization of the entire settlement makes unmistakable. And it shows a community at the edge of something, the marks on the pottery, the tentative differentiation in the burials, the sheer completeness and organization of the settlement itself. Banpo feels in the archaeological record like a society in the process of becoming something, not yet what Chinese civilization would eventually be, but moving in a direction, accumulating the social and symbolic complexity that larger-scale civilization would eventually require. The large communal building at the center of Banpo no longer stands. Its post holes remain, mapped and recorded, the ghost of a structure that once held 500 or 600 people shared life at its center. What happened in that building? What decisions were made there? What ceremonies performed? What stories told in the firelight about where these people came from and what they owed to the world that had made them possible? The marks on the pottery are still there, still waiting in their museum cases in Xi'an for someone to finally understand what they say, or perhaps for us to accept that some messages were never meant to travel this far. We leave the banks of the Chan River behind. We leave Banpo's pottery marks and its communal hall and its carefully oriented houses, its community balanced at the edge of something larger than itself, its messages pressed into clay that outlasted every hand that shaped them. We have been moving across this entire journey through a world that keeps insisting on the same truth, that the people who came before us were not waiting for us to arrive and give them meaning. They had their own meaning, their own knowledge, their own ways of reading the world that were, in certain respects, more precise and more intimate than anything we have since developed. Nowhere on this journey has that truth been more quietly, more completely demonstrated than in the place we are going now. We are leaving continental Europe and the great river valleys of China. We are going to an island. Not the temperate islands of Britain or the Mediterranean warmth of Sardinia, but an island in the Atlantic, volcanic, dramatic, its landscape shaped by geological forces that left behind a terrain of ravines and rock faces, and sudden vertical drops that give the interior of the island a quality of compressed intensity, as though the land itself is holding its breath. We are going to Gran Canaria, the Canary Islands, and we are going underground. The Risco Caído cultural landscape occupies a mountainous interior region of Gran Canaria, known as the Cenobio de Valeron area, a terrain of deep ravines cut into volcanic tuff, the soft rock that the island's original inhabitants, the Guanches, learned to work with extraordinary skill. The landscape is severe and beautiful in the way that volcanic landscapes often are, all contrast, all edge, the light falling at angles that make the rock seem to glow from within. The Guanches were the indigenous people of the Canary Islands, a Berber-related people who arrived on the islands from North Africa, by most estimates, sometime around 500 BC or possibly earlier, though some researchers push that date back further into the first millennium BC. They brought with them a culture that adapted, over the centuries of island isolation, into something distinctly their own, a society of farmers and herders, of cave dwellers and rock carvers, of people who developed a relationship with the particular landscape of Gran Canaria that was expressed, among other places, in the caves of Risco Caído. The caves are carved into the vertical face of a ravine, chambers excavated from the soft tuff with tools that left marks still visible in the rock, their interiors shaped with a precision that goes well beyond functional shelter. They are not homes. They are something else. Their floors, their walls, the careful geometry of their excavation, all of it speaks of purpose, of intention, of a use that was specific and repeated and significant. And then there are the apertures. At precise points in the ceilings and upper walls of several of the Risco Caído caves, openings have been cut or shaped, holes and niches whose dimensions and angles are not random. They are engineered. And what they were engineered to do is something that took researchers years to fully understand, and that, once understood, reframes everything else about the site. They catch the light. At specific moments in the astronomical calendar, the solstices, the equinoxes, and particularly the zenith passage of the sun, when the sun passes directly overhead and casts no shadow, light enters through these precisely positioned apertures and projects onto the interior surfaces of the caves in forms that are anything but accidental. Ellipses of light. Precise geometric shapes thrown by the sun through holes in the rock, landing on the carved walls and floors with an exactness that required, to achieve, a knowledge of solar movement and an engineering capability that is genuinely astonishing in a society conventionally described as prehistoric. The zenith passage, the moment when the sun is directly overhead, is an astronomical event that is invisible without a specific tool to detect it. You cannot see the sun reach the zenith by watching the sky. You need a device, a gnomon, a tube, an aperture oriented vertically, that makes the invisible event visible by the presence or absence of shadow, by the projection of light into a prepared space. The apertures of Risco Caído are exactly that. They are zenith tubes carved into the ceiling of an underground chamber, transforming an invisible astronomical moment into a spectacular visible event, a shaft of light descending through the darkness and landing, with perfect precision, on a prepared surface below. The carved decoration of those surfaces adds another layer of complexity. The walls of the Risco Caído caves are covered with engravings, geometric patterns, spirals, and a recurring motif that has drawn particular attention. A form that resembles a stylized vulva, interpreted by most researchers as a fertility symbol, connected to a goddess or Earth Mother tradition. These symbols cluster around the points where the projected light lands at significant astronomical moments, suggesting that the light and the symbol were designed to interact, that the moment of astronomical alignment was the moment when the light touched the sacred symbol, animating it, activating it, completing a ceremony that required both the carving and the sky to function together. The mainstream interpretation frames Risco Caído as a ritual and astronomical site connected to an agricultural calendar, a place where the community's religious specialists, or perhaps the community as a whole, gathered at key moments in the solar year to perform ceremonies tied to the cycles of planting and harvest, fertility and renewal. The UNESCO World Heritage designation awarded to the Risco Caído cultural landscape in 2019 explicitly recognizes the astronomical sophistication of the site, describing it as one of the most important examples of archaeoastronomy in the world. That recognition is significant, and it raises questions that the designation by its nature leaves open. The precision of the apertures at Risco Caído implies a process of astronomical observation, calculation, and engineering that was not spontaneous. To design an aperture that projects the zenith sun onto a specific point on a specific surface, you must first know when the zenith passage occurs, which requires long-term systematic observation. You must then understand the geometry of light projection well enough to calculate where an aperture of a given size and angle must be placed to achieve a specific effect. And you must execute that design in stone, carving into volcanic tuff with sufficient accuracy that the result, centuries later, still works. This is not folk knowledge, this is specialist knowledge. Accumulated, transmitted, applied with technical precision. Who held that knowledge among the Guanches of Gran Canaria? Was there a priestly class? A group of individuals whose role within the community was the maintenance of astronomical knowledge and the performance of the ceremonies it enabled? The historical sources on Guanche society, limited and filtered through the perspective of the Spanish colonizers who encountered them in the 15th century, describe something called the Harimaguadas, women who lived apart from ordinary society, dedicated to religious life, associated with the goddess tradition and with the maintenance of sacred sites. Were the Harimaguadas the custodians of Risco Caído? Were they the ones who understood the apertures, who knew which day the light would descend and what ceremony must be performed when it did? We cannot know. The Spanish conquest of the Canary Islands in the 15th century destroyed or disrupted the transmission of Guanche cultural knowledge with a thoroughness that makes recovery difficult. The Harimaguadas, if they existed in the form the early Spanish sources describe, did not survive as an institution into the period of literacy. What they knew, they carried. And when the world they inhabited ended, most of what they carried went with them. What remains is the stone. The apertures still open, still positioned with their original exactness. The carved symbols still present on the walls and floors where the light still falls, at the right moment, in the right season, with the same precision it always did. The Risco Caído caves sit in their ravine in the Gran Canaria interior, receiving the same sun they were designed to receive, performing the same optical event they were engineered to perform, centuries and centuries after the people who built them have gone. The light still enters. It still falls on the carved symbols with the accuracy of a clock that has never needed winding. But the ceremony that light was meant to complete, the words spoken, the offerings made, the meaning enacted in the moment when the shaft of sunlight touched the carved stone in the darkness of the cave, that is gone. The instrument still works. The music it was built to play has not been heard for 500 years. What was sung in those caves when the light came down? We leave Gran Canaria behind. We leave the caves of Risco Caído with their engineered apertures still open to a sky they were designed to read, their carved symbols waiting in the darkness for a light that still arrives on schedule at the appointed moment, even though no one is there to receive it, to speak the words, to complete the ceremony the aperture was built to enable. We carry that image with us, the instrument that still works, the music that has stopped. It is a feeling that has followed us across this entire journey, of standing at the edge of something that was once fully alive, fully inhabited by meaning, and finding only the physical shell of it remaining, the stones, the ditches, the carved rock, the fired clay, the bones arranged with deliberate care, all of it the residue of a living world that pressed against the boundary of the recoverable and then slipped mostly beyond it. Now we move north and east, out of the Atlantic back into the European interior, into a landscape that could not be more different from the volcanic drama of the Canary Islands. Flat, forested, lake-scattered, the Great Plain of Central Europe stretching in every direction with a patient, low-horizoned immensity that has its own quieter kind of power. We are going to Poland, to the Kuyavian-Pomeranian region of north-central Poland, where the landscape was shaped by glaciers and left behind a terrain of moraines and lakes and slow rivers that has been inhabited, in various configurations of settlement and culture, for as long as modern human beings have been in Europe. On a small peninsula jutting into Lake Biskupin, in the autumn of 1933, a local schoolteacher noticed something protruding from the shallow water at the lake's edge. Timber. Old timber. Darkened by the water, but still holding its shape with a firmness that suggested it was older than anything recently built. He reported what he had found. Archaeologists arrived, and what emerged from the peat and water of Lake Biskupin over the following years of excavation became one of the most celebrated and complete archaeological discoveries in European history. Biskupin, an Iron Age fortified settlement built on a lake peninsula in what is now central Poland, dating to approximately 738 BC. A town, a real, planned, fortified town, preserved by the anaerobic conditions of the lake sediment in a state of completeness that left the excavators, by all accounts, genuinely astonished. Because the water had saved the wood. This is the detail that makes Biskupin extraordinary among prehistoric sites. We have spent this entire journey working with stone, with megalithic chambers and carved rock faces, and dry stone towers whose durability is a function of their material. Wood, the other great building material of the ancient world, almost never survives. It rots, it burns, it disappears, leaving only post holes and charcoal traces from which archaeologists must reconstruct, speculatively, the structures that once stood. At Biskupin, the wood survived. The waterlogged anaerobic environment of the lake bottom preserved the timber of the settlement's construction with a fidelity that allowed researchers not merely to infer the existence of wooden structures, but to excavate them, to measure them, to study the tool marks left by the people who shaped them, and ultimately to reconstruct them. The reconstructed settlement at Biskupin today is one of the most complete experimental archaeological reconstructions in the world. What the wood revealed was a town of considerable sophistication and deliberate planning. The settlement was built on an artificial island, or more precisely, a natural peninsula that was reinforced and extended by the construction of a massive timber palisade and breakwater along its outer edges, protecting it from the lake and from whoever might approach across it. The palisade consisted of rows of oak and pine piles driven into the lake bed at an angle, designed to resist the impact of ice in winter, a structural solution that implies both engineering knowledge and prior experience of the specific threat that northern European lake ice poses to timber construction. Inside the palisade, a wooden rampart, a box structure filled with earth and sand, formed the defensive wall of the settlement, faced with timber and equipped with a walkway along its top. A single gate controlled access, connected to a log causeway that extended across the water to the shore. The entire defensive perimeter was continuous, carefully maintained, and designed with a coherence that speaks of centralized planning rather than incremental organic growth. The interior was organized with a regularity that modern urban planners would recognize as a grid. 13 rows of houses, each row containing between 17 and 23 individual dwellings, aligned along a series of parallel streets. Streets surfaced with split logs laid transversely, a form of wooden pavement that kept feet out of the mud and allowed wheeled vehicles to move through the settlement without difficulty. The streets converged at a central ring road that ran around the interior perimeter of the rampart, providing access to all parts of the settlement without requiring transit through the residential rows. The houses were uniform in their basic design, log-framed structures of approximately 9 by 8 meters, each containing an entrance vestibule and a main living space with a central hearth. The uniformity is striking. This was not a settlement where houses were built individually according to the preferences and resources of each family, accumulating organically into a village over time. It was built, or at least planned, as a unit, the grid laid out first, the house design standardized, the whole conceived before construction began as a coherent system rather than assembled piece by piece. Who had the authority to impose that level of planning on a community of several hundred people? What social structure produced the decision to build Biskupin as it was built, all at once, to a single plan, with a consistency that required every household to accept the same house design, the same street alignment, the same spatial organization? The mainstream interpretation places Biskupin within the Lusatian culture, a late Bronze Age and early Iron Age cultural tradition that flourished across Central Europe roughly between 1300 and 500 BC, characterized by urnfield burial practices and a material culture that shows increasing social complexity, and, in the later phases, the beginnings of proto-urban settlement. Biskupin represents, in this reading, a particularly complete example of a fortified Lusatian settlement, a community that chose a defensible lake peninsula, planned and built a fortified town with impressive engineering, and inhabited it for perhaps a century or two before abandoning it. The abandonment is one of the site's most discussed features. Evidence suggests that Biskupin was not destroyed by an enemy. There are no clear signs of violent destruction in the archaeological record. It was left. Gradually, perhaps, or relatively quickly, the population departed and the settlement was not rebuilt or reoccupied. The lake rose, or the peninsula became uninhabitable, or the community moved for reasons that the archaeology does not clearly specify. Why did they leave? The climate deterioration of the early first millennium BC, a period of cooling and increased moisture across northern Europe, has been proposed as a factor, rising lake levels making the peninsula increasingly difficult to inhabit and defend. But climate explanations, while plausible, feel insufficient as complete accounts of why a community abandons a settlement they have invested this level of effort in building. Something changed. Something made Biskupin untenable, or irrelevant, or both. And the community that had organized itself around this precise piece of lake-surrounded timber-built grid departed and did not return. The Nazis, during their occupation of Poland in the Second World War, excavated Biskupin extensively, drawn to it by an ideological desire to claim the Lusatian culture as Germanic, and therefore to incorporate the site into a narrative of ancient Germanic civilization in the East. The excavations were real and yielded real data, but the interpretive framework imposed on them was false and was dismantled after the war. The story of Biskupin's modern discovery is therefore also a story about how the past is claimed, distorted, and then slowly recovered from those distortions. What survived the Nazi excavations and survived the centuries of lake sediment before them is still extraordinary. The timber, the street grid, the house foundations, the palisade piles still standing in the lake at their original angles, still angled against the ice that no longer threatens them. There is something about Biskupin that is more immediately human than almost any other site on this journey. The log-paved streets under your feet, the doorways at a scale you could step through, the hearths where fires were lit against the Polish winter, in houses indistinguishable in their basic human function from the houses people were building across Europe at the same moment. These were not monument builders in the conventional sense. They were not raising stones to the sky or engineering light into underground chambers. They were building a town, a place to live, to sleep, to cook, to shelter children from the cold. And they built it with a precision and a planning that raises the same question, in a different register, that this entire journey has been asking. What did they know that we have underestimated? And what else is waiting, preserved in the cold and water of some undiscovered lake, for someone to notice the timber protruding from the shallows? We leave Poland behind. We leave Biskupin's log-paved streets and its standardized houses and its angled palisade still standing in the lake at the angle it was driven 3,000 years ago. We leave the question it pressed most quietly, but most insistently, not about monuments or astronomy or the movement of stones across impossible distances, but about the simpler, more human mystery of organized community life, of people deciding together how a town should be built and then building it that way, precisely and completely, and then walking away. From the flat lake country of central Poland, we move again to the Mediterranean. We move south and west, back into that sea that has given us so much on this journey. Monte rising from the Sardinian plain, the corbelled towers of the Nuraghic civilization, the eye-watched tombs of Los Millares in Andalusia. The Mediterranean was, in the prehistoric period, not a barrier, but a highway, a connective tissue along which peoples and ideas and materials moved with a freedom and a regularity that our fragmented historical accounts have consistently underestimated. We are going to Minorca, the second largest of the Balearic Islands, sitting in the western Mediterranean between the Spanish coast and Sardinia, an island of limestone plateaus and persistent wind, and a prehistoric heritage so dense that it has been recognized since 2019 as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in its entirety. Not for any single monument, but for the accumulated weight of what the people who lived here left behind across more than 1,000 years of Bronze Age occupation. And on a low hill in the flat agricultural landscape of the island's interior, roughly 5 kilometers from the town of Ciutadella, there stands something that stops you. It does not announce itself from a distance. The Minorcan landscape is modest in its topography. The island is not dramatically hilly, and the monuments embedded in it tend to emerge gradually as you approach rather than dominating the horizon from afar. But when the Naveta de Tudons resolves itself from the surrounding scrubland, when you are close enough to read its form and its scale and the quality of its construction, the stopping is involuntary. It is shaped like an upturned boat. The name confirms what the eye suggests. Naveta means little boat in Catalan, and the form of the structure, its tapered oval plan narrowing at one end and broadening at the other, its walls rising in a gentle curve to a flat top, does resemble nothing so much as the hull of a vessel turned upside down and pressed into the earth. Whether that resemblance was intentional, whether the builders of the Naveta des Tudons were deliberately evoking a boat, and if so, what symbolic weight a boat carried in their cosmology, is one of the questions that the monument poses and cannot answer from within itself. What we know is this: the Naveta de Tudons dates to approximately 1200 to 750 BC, placing it in the late Bronze Age, contemporary with the later phases of the Nuraghic civilization we examined on Sardinia, contemporary with the construction of Biskupin across the continent in Poland. Its walls are built from massive limestone blocks, some weighing several tons, fitted together without mortar in the dry stone tradition that appears, with variations, across the prehistoric Mediterranean. The exterior walls survive to a height of approximately 4 meters. The structure is roughly 14 meters long and 6 meters wide at its broadest point. Inside, the space is divided into 2 chambers stacked vertically. A lower chamber accessible through a small entrance in the narrower end of the structure, and an upper chamber reached by a now collapsed internal stairway. The entrance is low. To enter, you must bend, bow, a posture that is common in prehistoric funerary architecture across the world, and that is rarely accidental. The act of entering a sacred or funerary space on bent knees, with lowered head, is a physical enactment of the transition between the world outside and the world within, a bodily acknowledgement that you are crossing a threshold that demands a different orientation. The lower chamber of the Naveta de Tudons was a collective burial space. When excavated in the 1950s and 1960s, it was found to contain the disarticulated skeletal remains of at least 100 individuals, bones that had been moved, rearranged, curated in the same tradition of post-mortem management of the dead that we encountered at Perdigões in Portugal, at Locmariaquer in Brittany, at site after site across the prehistoric Atlantic world. Bodies were not simply interred here and left. They were returned to, revisited, their bones reorganized within the chamber over a period of use that extended across centuries. Alongside the bones, grave goods, ceramic vessels, bronze brooches, buttons, a stone bracelet, objects of daily life and personal adornment placed with the dead in a gesture whose precise meaning varies by culture, but whose basic logic is consistent. The dead needed things, or the living needed to give things, or the relationship between the living and the dead required material expression to be properly maintained. The mainstream interpretation of the Naveta des Tudons places it within the broader context of the Talaiotic culture, the Bronze Age society that inhabited the Balearic Islands, particularly Minorca and Majorca, and that produced a distinctive monumental tradition, including the talaiots, conical stone towers, the taulas, T-shaped stone settings unique to Minorca, and the navetas, the boat-shaped collective tombs of which the Naveta de Tudons is the best preserved and most studied example. The navetas were, this reading suggests, the funerary architecture of communities that practiced collective burial and maintained ongoing relationships with their accumulated dead, ancestors who continued, through the bones preserved in the chamber, to be present in and relevant to the life of the living community. That interpretation is solid and well evidenced, and it leaves the most interesting questions standing. Consider the form, the upturned boat. In prehistoric Mediterranean cultures, the boat was a vessel of transition, the means by which the living crossed water, and by extension the means by which the dead might cross whatever body of water separated one world from another. The boat, as a metaphor for the journey of the dead, appears in Egyptian funerary tradition, in Norse burial practice, in cultures separated by geography and chronology, who arrived at the same symbolic solution to the same imaginative problem. Did the builders of the Naveta des Tudons intend this resonance? Was the boat shape a deliberate statement about what the structure was? A vessel for the dead? A ship that carried its passengers not across water but across the boundary between life and whatever followed? We cannot know. The Talaiotic culture left no writing. Their beliefs, their cosmology, the specific meanings they attached to the forms they built in stone, all of it exists only in the physical residue that the limestone of Minorca has preserved. The taulas that appear at other Talaiotic sites add another layer of mystery. These T-shaped settings, a massive vertical stone capped by an equally massive horizontal one, enclosed within a horseshoe of smaller stones, are unique to Minorca, found nowhere else in the prehistoric world. Their function is unknown. Their orientation is consistent. Most taulas face roughly south, suggesting astronomical alignment, but the specific celestial event they were designed to mark has not been conclusively identified. Some researchers have proposed connections to lunar cycles, others to specific star risings, others to a solar event in the southern sky that would have been visible from Minorca's latitude. Whatever the taulas meant to the Talaiotic people, they were important enough to build in a form that required moving and raising stones of extraordinary weight. The same impulse that raised the menhirs of Brittany and the Sarsens of Stonehenge was at work here, on this small Mediterranean island, shaping limestone into forms that encoded meanings we have not yet recovered. The Naveta de Tudons stands in its field on the Menorcan plain, as it has stood for 3,000 years. The entrance is still low. The limestone walls are still fitted with that dry stone precision that requires no mortar, because the geometry of the stones themselves provides the stability. The bones within were removed during excavation, and some have been replaced, a gesture toward restoring the relationship between the structure and the dead it was built to hold. There is something about the boat shape that stays with you after you leave, that deliberate curve, that tapered end pointing westward, toward the setting sun, toward the ocean, toward wherever the Taliotic dead were imagined to be going. 3,000 years of Menorcan wind have moved across the Naveta de Tudons without disturbing it. It was built to last. It was built to hold something. Bones, memory, belief, the ongoing relationship between a community and its dead, for as long as stone could hold anything. The bones are still there. The wind is still moving. And the ship, patiently, has not yet arrived at wherever it was pointed. We leave Menorca behind. We leave the Naveta de Tudons, pointing its tapered western end toward a destination it has never reached, its limestone walls holding 3,000 years of wind and silence, and the patient weight of the dead arranged within it. We leave the Taliotic world, its boat-shaped tombs and its T-shaped stones, and its unanswered questions about what it meant to build a ship from limestone and fill it with ancestors. And we move back to the mainland. Not far. We remain in the western Mediterranean, in that broad cultural zone that stretches along the coastline of what is now Spain, where the evidence of prehistoric life has accumulated in layers so dense and so varied that a single lifetime of archaeological work cannot encompass it. We have already visited Los Millares in Andalusia, with its concentric walls and its eye-motif pottery, and its 80-passage tombs watching the surrounding plain. We have passed through the Iberian Peninsula on our way to and from other places, glimpsing the depth of what lies beneath its soil. Now we stop, in Catalonia, at the edge of a lake. Lake Banyoles is the largest natural lake in Catalonia, a body of water fed by underground springs that give it an unusual clarity and a constancy of level that has made its shores attractive to human settlement for an extraordinarily long time. The town of Banyoles sits at its edge today, an unremarkable provincial town in the Girona province, its lake used for recreation and rowing, its prehistoric significance not announced by anything visible from the shore. But at the northeastern edge of the lake, just above the waterline, the ground holds a secret that the lake itself has been keeping for more than 7,000 years. La Draga. It was identified in the 1990s, when drainage works near the lake shore began to expose wooden stakes in the waterlogged sediment, the same kind of accidental discovery that revealed Biskupin in Poland, the same intervention of modern infrastructure into ancient preservation. What the stakes indicated, and what subsequent excavation has confirmed, is the existence of a Neolithic lake dwelling, a village built on the margins of Lake Banyoles, approximately 5300 to 4800 BC, its wooden structures preserved by the same anaerobic waterlogged conditions that saved Biskupin's timber across the continent. La Draga is the oldest Neolithic lake dwelling ever found in the Iberian Peninsula, and it is, by any measure, one of the most significant Neolithic sites in southwestern Europe. The village was built directly on the lake shore, or perhaps partially over the lake itself, its structures raised on wooden piles driven into the lake bed, a form of construction known as a pile dwelling that appears across Neolithic Europe in a tradition so widespread and so consistent that UNESCO recognized it collectively as a World Heritage phenomenon in 2011, designating the prehistoric pile dwellings around the Alps as a single transnational heritage site. La Draga is part of that broader tradition, the southernmost expression of a lake-dwelling culture that stretched from Spain across southern France and Switzerland and northern Italy into the Alpine region, a cultural zone connected by shared architectural solutions to the particular challenge and particular opportunity of life at the water's edge. Why build on water? The question seems counterintuitive until you consider what the water provides. Protection. A lake is a moat that requires no engineering, a defensive perimeter maintained by geography rather than by human labor. Access. Boats can move materials and people with an efficiency that land transport in the Neolithic simply cannot match. Preservation of food. The cool water of a lake edge extends the life of stored organic materials. And resources. Fish, waterfowl, aquatic plants, the particular ecological richness of a lake margin that supplements the agriculture and animal husbandry that the surrounding land provides. The people of La Draga were farmers. This is established clearly by the botanical and faunal evidence recovered from the waterlogged deposits: emmer wheat and einkorn, lentils, flax, acorns, along with the bones of domestic cattle, sheep, goat, and pig. They were not the hunter-gatherers whose traces we followed at Dolní Věstonice, not the nomadic or semi-nomadic communities who built Arkaim on the steppe. They were settled agriculturalists, tied to their fields and their herds, building their village at the lake edge with a permanence that the wooden piles, driven deep into the lake bed, express as clearly as any stone monument. The wooden posts recovered from La Draga number in the thousands. They were driven into the lake sediment in organized rows and clusters that allow researchers to infer the ground plans of the structures they supported. Rectangular buildings, aligned consistently, their floors raised above the water or the marshy ground on a platform of horizontal timbers supported by the vertical piles. The scale of the timber investment required to build and maintain La Draga across its several centuries of occupation was considerable. Thousands of oak and other hardwood trunks, felled, shaped, transported, and driven into the lakebed in a process that required both technical skill and organized community labor. What the waterlogged conditions preserved at La Draga goes beyond the structural timbers. Organic materials that vanish entirely from dry archaeological sites survive here in extraordinary condition. Wooden tools, basketry, textile fragments, seeds and plant remains that allow researchers to reconstruct not just what the La Draga community grew, but how they processed it, stored it, prepared it. Botanical remains that speak of a fully developed agricultural system, with crop diversity and processing techniques that reflect generations of accumulated farming knowledge. There is also a bow, a complete Neolithic bow carved from yew wood, recovered from the waterlogged deposits of La Draga in a state of preservation that allowed researchers to study its form and construction in detail. It is one of the oldest complete bows ever found in Europe. Alongside it, arrow shafts, the equipment of hunting, preserved alongside the equipment of farming, in a community that practiced both, that drew on the lake and the surrounding forest even as it cultivated the fields above the waterline. The mainstream interpretation of La Draga presents it as a typical, if exceptionally well-preserved, example of early Neolithic agricultural settlement in the Western Mediterranean. A community of the cardial or epicardial culture, the tradition responsible for introducing agriculture to the Iberian Peninsula from its origins in the Near East, moving westward along the Mediterranean coast in the 6th and 5th millennia BC. La Draga, this reading suggests, represents one node in that agricultural expansion, a successful community of early farmers who chose a lake-edge location for its practical advantages and built their village there with the skills and knowledge their tradition had developed. That framework is well evidenced and almost certainly broadly correct. And within it, details accumulate that press against the simple narrative of agricultural expansion. The sophistication of the textile fragments recovered from La Draga, for instance, woven from plant fibers with a regularity that implies not just skill, but established technique. A weaving tradition already mature by the time these particular textiles were made, already past the stage of experiment and into the stage of craft production transmitted across generations. Where did that tradition begin? How far back does the thread of that knowledge run? The diversity of the crop assemblage raises similar questions. Early Neolithic communities are sometimes imagined as experimenters, trying agriculture for the first time, learning by doing, making mistakes that the archaeological record quietly records. The crop diversity at La Draga suggests a community already well past that experimental phase, a community that knew which crops grew well in this specific landscape, which combinations provided nutritional security, how to manage the particular challenge of farming in the water-influenced microclimate of a lake edge. Some researchers have pointed to the evidence of long-distance exchange at La Draga, objects whose raw materials came from distant sources, suggesting that the lake-dwelling community was not isolated but connected, through trade networks we are only beginning to trace, to communities across the western Mediterranean and beyond. The obsidian found at the site, the specific stone used for certain tools, the ceramic traditions that show influences from both local and more distant sources. Who were the trading partners of La Draga? What moved along those networks in both directions? Not just object, ideas too, techniques, beliefs, the kind of knowledge that doesn't leave a physical trace, but that shapes everything about how a community builds, plants, and understands the world it inhabits. The lake still holds La Draga. The waterlogged sediment still preserves what the water covered. Slowly, as excavation proceeds season by season, the village gives up more of itself to the people trying to understand it. But the lake is also encroaching. The water level of Banyoles has shifted over the centuries, and parts of the site that were once accessible are now submerged more deeply. The race between excavation and inundation is one that the lake may eventually win. What is still under there, in the cold and dark of the lake sediment, waiting for a question precise enough or a technique refined enough to recover it? What does La Draga still hold that no one has yet asked it to give up? The water knows. The water has always known. It simply has not been asked in the right language yet. We leave the lake. We leave La Draga's cold water still holding its secrets in the sediment, still preserving what it covered 7,000 years ago with a fidelity that shames the dry record everywhere else. We leave the village in the water and we move northeast, inland, away from the Mediterranean and its particular quality of light, into the heart of Central Europe. The landscape changes. The limestone and the olive scrub give way to the deep agricultural plain of the Danube basin, broad, flat, extraordinarily fertile land that has been farmed for so long that the farming itself has become a kind of geology, layer upon layer of human cultivation pressed into the earth until the earth and the human activity are no longer fully separable. This is old farming country, some of the oldest in Europe. We are going to Slovakia, to the Nitra region of southwestern Slovakia, where the Jitava River moves through a flat agricultural plain, and where the soil, dark and deep and patient, has been yielding up evidence of prehistoric habitation for as long as people have been digging into it. Near the town of Vráble, in a field that looked, until recently, like any other field in this part of Central Europe, flat, cultivated, unremarkable from the road, archaeologists have been uncovering something that has quietly redrawn the map of European prehistory. Vráble, a Neolithic mega-settlement. and one of the largest prehistoric villages ever found in Central Europe. The site was identified through aerial photography and geophysical survey before a single trowel broke the surface, the characteristic patterns of Neolithic longhouse foundations visible from the air as crop marks, the differential growth of plants over disturbed and undisturbed soil, creating a ghostly image of the settlement's plan that can be read from above even when nothing is visible at ground level. What those surveys revealed was a settlement of extraordinary scale, a planned, organized community covering approximately 50 hectares and containing, at its peak, something in the region of 300 longhouses arranged in 3 distinct but interconnected neighborhoods, each neighborhood encircled by its own ditch system, the whole enclosed within a larger outer boundary. 50 hectares, 300 longhouses, a population estimate by archaeologists who have been careful in their calculations of between 3,000 and 5,000 people, living here, together, in Neolithic Central Europe, approximately 5,200 to 4950 BC, 3,000 to 5,000 people in 5,200 BC. That number requires the same kind of pause that the date of Sechin Bajo required earlier in this journey. Because in 5,200 BC, in the conventional narrative of European prehistory, settled communities of this scale are not supposed to exist. The Neolithic of Central Europe is understood as a period of small village communities. The linear pottery culture, known to archaeologists as the LBK, building their characteristic longhouses in dispersed farming settlements of a few dozen to perhaps a few hundred people, gradually colonizing the fertile loess soils of the Danube basin and its tributaries with an agricultural lifestyle that was still, in many regions, relatively new. Vráble doesn't fit that picture, it explodes it. The settlement belongs to the later phases of the LBK tradition, but its scale places it in a different category from everything else known from this culture. The closest parallels, other large LBK settlements identified across Central Europe, are significantly smaller. Vráble appears to have been, in the terminology that archaeologists have begun carefully applying to it, a Neolithic megasite. An agglomeration of population at a scale that implies social and economic dynamics we don't yet have adequate frameworks to describe. The 3 neighborhoods into which the settlement was organized are perhaps the most revealing feature. Each neighborhood had its own enclosing ditch, a boundary that defined it as a distinct unit within the larger whole. The neighborhoods were not identical in their internal organization, suggesting that they may have represented different social groups, different clans, lineages, or communities of origin that came together at Vráble while maintaining distinct internal identities, their separateness expressed in the ditches that set them apart, even while living within the same overarching settlement boundary. This tripartite structure has prompted researchers to ask fundamental questions about how social organization worked at Vráble. Was there a central authority that governed the whole settlement, overseeing the relationships between the 3 neighborhoods? Or was the settlement more like a federation, 3 distinct communities sharing a space and perhaps a set of common practices without surrendering internal autonomy to a central power? The archaeological evidence currently leans towards something more complex than either of those models. Analysis of the house sizes and the spatial distribution of material wealth across the 3 neighborhoods suggests that they were not equal, that one neighborhood was somewhat larger, somewhat more materially prominent than the other 2. But the differences are not extreme enough to indicate the kind of sharp hierarchical inequality that we associate with later Bronze Age or Iron Age chiefdoms. What Vráble seems to represent is a form of social organization that sits in between, more complex than the egalitarian village model that most LBK settlements suggest, but less stratified than the elite-dominated societies that would emerge in Europe in later millennia. A middle ground that we don't have a good vocabulary for, because it doesn't fit neatly into the stages that conventional archaeological narrative has laid out for the development of social complexity. The longhouses themselves are the basic unit of this complexity. LBK longhouses are among the most distinctive structures in European prehistory. Massive timber-framed buildings, typically between 15 and 45 meters long and 5 to 7 meters wide, their interiors divided into functional zones, their construction requiring substantial quantities of timber and significant organized labor. At Vráble, the longhouses were arranged within each neighborhood in orientations that were consistent but not rigidly uniform, a pattern that suggests shared spatial conventions without absolute standardization, the kind of organized flexibility that implies a community managing the tension between collective norms and individual household autonomy. Some of the longhouses at Vráble were rebuilt multiple times on the same footprint, the same plot of ground reused across generations, the timber replaced as it rotted, the household continuity maintained in the same location across what may have been a century or more of occupation. That continuity of place speaks of deep attachment, of a community that understood itself as rooted in specific ground, that passed the occupation of specific house plots from one generation to the next in a way that implies inherited identity attached to location. Then, sometime around 4950 BC, Vráble was abandoned. Not destroyed, there is no evidence of violent destruction, no burning of the settlement, no sign of conflict that ended it. It was left. 3,000 to 5,000 people departed from a settlement they or their ancestors had maintained for 2.5 centuries, and they did not come back. Where did they go? The LBK culture itself was in transition during this period, showing signs of fragmentation and change across Central Europe that some researchers have connected to population pressure, resource depletion, or social tensions that the existing organizational forms could no longer contain. Vráble may have been a victim of its own success, a settlement that drew population from a wide region, growing to a scale that exceeded what the surrounding agricultural land could sustainably support, until the accumulated stress made dispersal preferable to continuation. Or something else happened, something that the archaeological record has not yet clearly told us. The geophysical surveys that revealed Vráble's plan have also identified features that excavation has not yet fully investigated, anomalies in the soil that may represent structures or deposits or activities whose nature remains unclear. The excavation of Vráble is ongoing. The site continues to yield new information with each season of fieldwork, each new analytical technique applied to what has already been recovered. There are questions about the ritual life of Vráble that the current evidence only partially addresses. The LBK tradition included complex burial practices, depositions of special objects in specific contexts, and evidence of symbolic activity that implies a rich ceremonial life. But the expression of that life at Vráble's scale remains only partially understood. What happened at the center of those three neighborhoods, in the spaces between the longhouses, in the areas that the geophysical surveys suggest were kept relatively clear of structures? What were 3,000 to 5,000 people doing together, in the middle of the Neolithic, in southwestern Slovakia, that required this scale of settlement and this degree of organized spatial complexity? The fields above Vráble grow the same crops they have grown for centuries. The Žitava River moves past as it always has. The soil keeps its record. A community of thousands lived here and then, all at once or gradually, was gone. They left the foundations of their houses in the earth and their ditches still traceable from the air, and their questions still unanswered in the dark loam of the Slovak plain. Who were they to each other, those three neighborhoods? And what held them together for 2.5 centuries before whatever it was finally let go?